The foundations of the Adeptus Ministorum rest upon one of the most profound theological reversals in human history. During the Great Crusade, the Emperor of Mankind stood as the galaxy's most vocal opponent of religious belief, wielding the imperial truth as his weapon against superstition and faith. Yet within mere centuries of his interment upon the Golden Throne, this same figure would become the object of the most widespread and fervent religious devotion humanity had ever known. The origins of this transformation lie in a document that would reshape the spiritual landscape of the Imperium, the Lectitio Divinitatis. Authored by Lorgar Aurelian, Primarch of the Word-Bearers Legion, this text emerged from the ashes of Monarchia, the perfect city that the emperor himself had ordered destroyed as punishment for Lorgar's worship. The irony was not lost on those who understood the deeper currents of history. The very act meant to suppress religious devotion had instead catalyzed its most enduring expression. Lorgar crafted the Lectitio Divinitatis as both theological treatise and desperate plea for understanding. Within its pages, he laid out the fundamental argument that would eventually consume the Imperium, that the emperor's denial of his own divinity was itself proof of his godhood, for only a being of infinite humility and divine nature would reject the worship he so clearly deserved. The text wove together philosophical arguments with observed evidence of the emperor's miraculous abilities, his immortal nature, and his capacity to inspire absolute devotion across countless worlds. The document spread through the Imperium like wildfire despite official prohibition. Copies were transcribed by hand in the holds of merchant vessels, whispered between soldiers in the trenches of compliance campaigns, and secretly distributed among the populations of newly conquered worlds. The imperial authorities found themselves fighting a war against ideas, attempting to suppress a text that spoke to the deepest spiritual needs of humanity scattered across the galaxy. The Horus Heresy transformed the Lectitio Divinitatis from forbidden doctrine to prophetic revelation. As half the Space Marine legions turned traitor, and the galaxy burned in civil war, desperate imperial citizens found themselves facing an existential crisis that the imperial truth could not address. The cold rationalism of the Great Crusade offered no comfort to those watching their worlds burn, their families slaughtered, and their civilization torn apart by beings they had been taught to revere as heroes. In this crucible of suffering and betrayal, the words of Lorgar's text took on new meaning. The Emperor's battle against the forces of chaos on Terra, his sacrifice upon the Golden Throne to maintain the Astronomicon, and his continued guidance of humanity from beyond death became proof of his divine nature. The theological arguments that had once seemed like heretical speculation now appeared as divine revelation, validated by the Emperor's ultimate sacrifice for humanity's survival. The transformation was not immediate or uniform. In the immediate aftermath of the heresy, the Lectitio Divinitatis existed alongside numerous other religious movements, mystery cults, and spiritual traditions that emerged from humanity's collective trauma. Some worlds embraced ancestor worship, venerating the emperor as the greatest of human spirits. Others developed elaborate mythologies around the Primarchs, viewing them as divine champions in an eternal struggle against darkness. Still others focused on the emperor's role as master of the warp, seeing him as humanity's shield against the predations of chaos. The theological evolution that followed the heresy represented a complete inversion of the emperor's original vision. Where he had preached the supremacy of reason and the imperial truth, his followers now embraced faith as the ultimate expression of human devotion. Where he had rejected worship and demanded to be seen as a man, albeit an extraordinary one, his subjects now proclaimed his divinity as the fundamental truth of existence. This transformation reflected not just a change in doctrine, but a fundamental shift in humanity's understanding of its place in the galaxy. The core tenets of what would become the Imperial Creed crystallized around several fundamental beliefs. The Emperor's divine nature formed the cornerstone of this new faith, but it was a divinity defined by sacrifice rather than power. Unlike the gods of ancient Terra, who were often portrayed as capricious or distant, the Emperor was understood as a deity who had willingly suffered for his people. His agony upon the Golden Throne was not seen as weakness or defeat, but as the ultimate expression of divine love and protection. This emphasis on suffering as a divine attribute permeated every aspect of imperial theology. The faithful were taught that the emperor's pain was shared by all true believers, that through their own suffering they participated in his divine nature. This doctrine provided a theological framework for the grinding hardships of life in the 41st millennium, transforming the daily struggles of imperial citizens from meaningless brutalities into sacred acts of communion with their God. The concept of humanity's manifest destiny became equally central to imperial doctrine. The faithful were taught that humanity alone among the galaxy's species possessed the divine spark, that they were chosen by the emperor to inherit the stars. This belief drew heavily from the original ideals of the Great Crusade, but transformed them from secular ambition into religious imperative. The conquest of the galaxy was no longer merely a political or military goal, but a sacred duty ordained by divine will. This doctrine of human supremacy necessarily defined itself in opposition to the alien, the mutant, and the heretic. The abhorrence of the Xenos became not just a practical policy, but a theological necessity. Alien species were viewed as fundamentally corrupt, lacking the divine spark that made humanity special. Their very existence was seen as an affront to the Emperor's plan for the galaxy, and their destruction became a sacred duty rather than mere conquest. The hatred of mutants reflected deeper anxieties about purity and corruption. In a galaxy where chaos could twist flesh and soul alike, physical deviation became a sign of spiritual contamination. The doctrine taught that the human form was sacred, created in the Emperor's image, and that any deviation from this template represented a fall from grace. This belief provided theological justification for the brutal persecution of mutants throughout the Imperium, transforming practical concerns about genetic stability into religious imperatives. Heretics occupied a special place in imperial theology as the most despised of enemies. Unlike Xenos, who were alien by nature, or mutants, who were corrupted by circumstance, heretics were humans who had willfully rejected the Emperor's truth. They represented the possibility of corruption that existed within every human soul, the constant temptation to turn away from the light of faith. The violence directed against heretics was therefore not just punishment, but purification, an attempt to cleanse the stain of their betrayal from the human species. The role of martyrdom in imperial doctrine elevated suffering from mere endurance to active virtue. The faithful were taught that death in service to the Emperor was not an end, but a transformation, a passage from mortal service to eternal communion with the divine. This belief drew inspiration from the countless heroes of the Heresy who had died defending the Imperium, transforming their deaths from tragic losses into glorious victories. The theology of martyrdom provided meaning for the countless deaths that the Imperium's survival demanded. Soldiers dying in forgotten wars on distant worlds, workers perishing in industrial accidents, civilians sacrificing themselves to prevent chaos incursions, all were understood as participating in the Emperor's own sacrifice. Their deaths became sacred acts that sustained the Imperium's spiritual as well as physical existence. Sacrifice extended beyond death to encompass every aspect of imperial life. The faithful were taught that comfort was corruption, that ease led to complacency and spiritual decay. The harsh conditions of life in the Imperium were therefore not failures of governance but necessary trials that strengthened the soul. Citizens who endured starvation, workers who labored in dangerous conditions, and soldiers who faced impossible odds were all participating in the divine plan through their suffering. This doctrine of redemptive suffering provided the theological foundation for the Imperium's brutal social order. The grinding oppression that characterized life for most imperial citizens was transformed from systemic failure into sacred necessity. The powerful were understood to bear the burden of command, while the weak served through their endurance. Every level of society participated in the great work of human survival through their particular form of sacrifice. The emphasis on spiritual purity through suffering created a complex relationship between the physical and metaphysical realms. The body was understood as both sacred vessel and potential source of corruption. Physical pain could purify the soul, but physical pleasure could lead to spiritual damnation. This tension manifested in numerous practices throughout imperial society, from the self-flagellation of penitent cults to the ritual scarification practiced by certain military orders. The transformation of the Lectitio Divinitatis from heretical text to foundational doctrine represented more than theological evolution. It reflected humanity's fundamental response to the horrors of the galaxy they inhabited. Faced with threats that defied rational explanation, with enemies that could corrupt soul as well as flesh, and with a universe that seemed actively hostile to human existence, the species had embraced faith as both weapon and shield. The stark contrast between the Emperor's original vision and the religious fervor that would eventually consume the Imperium becomes most apparent when examining the systematic campaign against faith that defined the Great Crusade era. The imperial truth represented far more than mere secular governance. It constituted a comprehensive ideological framework designed to eliminate religious thought from human consciousness entirely. This campaign operated on multiple levels, from the grand strategic decisions that shaped entire sectors to the intimate daily lives of individual citizens across thousands of worlds. During the height of the Great Crusade, imperial compliance fleets carried with them not just the military might necessary to conquer worlds, but also specialized cadres of ideological officers whose sole purpose was the eradication of religious belief. These iterators, as they were known, deployed alongside the Astartes legions and imperial army regiments, wielding rhetoric and reason as weapons against faith. Their methods varied according to local conditions, but their objective remained constant: the complete replacement of religious worldviews with the rational materialism of the imperial truth. The process typically began with the identification and cataloging of local religious practices, from organized priesthoods to folk traditions passed down through generations. Iterator teams would establish re-education centers in conquered territories, often repurposing existing religious structures for their new purpose. Ancient cathedrals became lecture halls where former believers were subjected to intensive courses in rational thinking. Sacred texts were publicly burned while their former adherents watched, replaced with treatises on science, logic, and the Emperor's vision for humanity's destiny among the stars. The suppression campaign extended beyond mere education to encompass systematic cultural destruction. Religious artifacts were confiscated and destroyed, not merely hidden away for potential future use. Pilgrimage routes that had existed for millennia were deliberately disrupted by the construction of industrial facilities or military installations. Sacred sites were often chosen as locations for particularly mundane imperial infrastructure, waste processing facilities, vehicle maintenance depots, or administrative offices, deliberately designed to strip away any lingering sense of the sacred. The effectiveness of these methods varied considerably across different worlds and cultures. Some populations, particularly those with strong scientific traditions or histories of religious conflict, embraced the imperial truth with genuine enthusiasm. They viewed the elimination of superstition as liberation from centuries of ignorance and oppression. Other worlds resisted more subtly, maintaining the outward forms of compliance while preserving their beliefs in hidden practices and secret gatherings. The Space Marine legions themselves served as living embodiments of the imperial truth's principles. These transhuman warriors represented the pinnacle of human achievement through science and reason, their very existence proof that humanity could transcend its limitations without recourse to supernatural intervention. Their presence on newly compliant worlds served a dual purpose: military enforcement of imperial will and ideological demonstration of what humanity could achieve through rational application of knowledge and technology. The Primarchs, despite their own complex relationships with belief and tradition, generally supported their father's vision during this period. Even Lorgar, before his fall to chaos, initially attempted to reconcile his spiritual inclinations with the imperial truth's demands. His early efforts to venerate the Emperor as the pinnacle of human achievement, rather than as a divine being, represented one of many attempts to find middle ground between the demands of the imperial truth and humanity's persistent spiritual needs. The campaign against religion during the Great Crusade was not merely destructive, but actively constructive, seeking to replace faith with alternative sources of meaning and purpose. Imperial propaganda promoted the conquest of the galaxy as humanity's manifest destiny, achieved through the application of reason, science, and unified will. Citizens were encouraged to find fulfillment in their contributions to this great work, whether as soldiers expanding the Imperium's borders, workers building its infrastructure, or administrators managing its vast bureaucracy. The Imperial Truth's vision of human potential extended beyond mere material achievement to encompass psychological and social transformation. Humanity was to be unified not just politically, but intellectually, sharing common rational frameworks for understanding reality. Regional variations in culture and tradition were tolerated only insofar as they did not conflict with this broader rational consensus. The ultimate goal was a species freed from the limitations imposed by superstition, fear, and irrational belief. This systematic suppression of religion created profound tensions within human society that would prove critical in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy. While the Imperial Truth succeeded in eliminating organized religious institutions across much of the Imperium, it could not address the fundamental spiritual needs that had driven humanity to develop religious beliefs in the first place. The existential questions that faith had traditionally answered, the meaning of suffering, the purpose of existence, the nature of death, remained unanswered by the cold rationalism of the Imperial Truth. The Horus Heresy shattered the intellectual foundations upon which the Imperial Truth rested. The revelation that the Emperor had concealed the existence of chaos, that the warp contained entities of immense power and malevolence, and that even the Primarchs could fall to corruption, undermined the basic premise that rational understanding could encompass all of reality. Citizens who had been taught that the universe operated according to comprehensible natural laws suddenly found themselves confronting forces that defied rational explanation. The immediate aftermath of the heresy saw not a gradual evolution of belief, but an explosive resurgence of religious sentiment across the Imperium. Populations that had been forcibly converted to the Imperial Truth found themselves spiritually unprepared for the cosmic horror they now faced. The careful rational frameworks that had replaced their traditional beliefs proved inadequate to process the reality of demonic invasion, planetary-scale corruption, and the betrayal of figures they had been taught to revere as exemplars of human achievement. In this context, the surviving copies of the Lectitio Divinitatis took on new significance. Where they had once been regarded as dangerous heretical texts, they now appeared as prophetic warnings about the true nature of reality. Lorger's arguments about the Emperor's divine nature seemed vindicated by his sacrifice upon the Golden Throne, his ongoing battle against the forces of chaos, and his continued guidance of humanity through the Astronomican's light. The transformation was not uniform across the Imperium. Different worlds and sectors developed their own interpretations of these events, creating a diverse landscape of religious movements that would eventually coalesce into the unified Imperial Creed. Some regions emphasized the Emperor's role as humanity's protector, developing elaborate rituals designed to strengthen his power and maintain his vigil. Others focused on his sacrifice, creating traditions of penance and self-denial that sought to share in his suffering. The early decades following the heresy saw the emergence of numerous competing religious movements, each claiming to represent the true understanding of the Emperor's nature and humanity's proper relationship with him. Some groups developed around charismatic preachers who claimed direct revelation from the Emperor. Others formed around the veneration of particular saints or martyrs from the heresy period. Still others emerged from the fusion of pre-imperial local traditions with the new understanding of the Emperor's divinity. These diverse religious movements shared certain common characteristics that would eventually form the core of imperial doctrine. All acknowledged the Emperor's divine nature, though they differed in their understanding of what this divinity entailed. All emphasized the special destiny of humanity among the galaxy's species, viewing the Imperium's survival as evidence of divine favor. All developed elaborate practices designed to demonstrate faith and secure divine protection against the manifold threats facing human civilization. The consolidation of these various movements into a unified religious structure began during the early centuries of the 32nd millennium, driven by both practical necessity and theological development. The administrative challenges of governing a galaxy spanning empire required standardized religious practices that could function across diverse worlds and cultures. Local variations in belief and practice, while tolerated to some degree, needed to be subordinated to broader imperial needs. The process of religious unification was neither smooth nor unopposed. Different movements competed for official recognition and imperial patronage, sometimes violently. Theological disputes that might seem abstract to modern observers carried profound political implications, as different interpretations of imperial doctrine could justify radically different approaches to governance, military strategy, and social organization. The emerging Ecclesiarchy faced the complex task of creating doctrinal unity while maintaining the passionate devotion that made imperial faith such a powerful force. Too much standardization risked reducing religious fervor to mere bureaucratic compliance, while too much diversity threatened to fragment the Imperium along sectarian lines. The solution involved the development of a hierarchical religious structure that could accommodate local variations within a broader framework of orthodox belief. The formal recognition of the Adeptus Ministorum as a pillar of imperial governance represented the culmination of this process of religious consolidation. This recognition was not merely ceremonial, but reflected the practical reality that religious institutions had become essential to the Imperium's functioning. The Ecclesiarchy provided not just spiritual guidance, but also social services, educational programs, and even military support through organizations like the Frateris Militia. The integration of religious authority into imperial governance created new forms of power and influence that would shape the Imperium's development for millennia to come. Ecclesiarchs and cardinals gained political authority that rivaled that of planetary governors and sector commanders. Religious doctrine became a tool of statecraft, used to justify policies and mobilize populations for imperial objectives. This growing religious authority inevitably led to tensions with other imperial institutions. The Adeptus Mechanicus, with its own distinct religious traditions focused on the machine god, maintained an uneasy relationship with the Ecclesiarchy. The Space Marine chapters, many of which preserved their own spiritual traditions from the Great Crusade era, sometimes found themselves at odds with ecclesiarchal doctrine. The Imperial Guard and Navy, while generally supportive of imperial faith, occasionally chafed under religious oversight of military operations. The theological developments of this period established patterns that would persist throughout imperial history. The emphasis on suffering as a path to spiritual purification became institutionalized in practices ranging from ritual flagellation to the deliberate maintenance of harsh living conditions. The doctrine of human supremacy provided justification for increasingly brutal policies toward alien species and mutant populations. The cult of martyrdom transformed military service from civic duty into religious obligation. These doctrinal foundations created the ideological framework that would eventually enable the excesses of the age of apostasy. The concentration of religious authority in the hands of the Ecclesiarchy, the integration of faith with political power, and the development of militant religious organizations all contributed to the conditions that would allow figures like Goj Vandir to seize control of the Imperium itself. The very success of the Adeptus Ministorum in establishing itself as a central institution of imperial governance contained the seeds of its own future corruption. The consolidation of religious authority within the Imperium created unprecedented opportunities for ambitious individuals to wield power that transcended traditional governmental boundaries. By the 36th millennium, the Adeptus Ministorum had evolved into a vast bureaucratic machine that touched every aspect of imperial life, from the spiritual guidance provided to individual citizens to the grand strategic decisions that shaped entire sectors. This concentration of religious and temporal authority would prove catastrophic when it fell into the hands of a man whose ambition matched only his capacity for cruelty and corruption. Goj Vandir's rise to power began not within the Ecclesiarchy itself, but through the labyrinthine corridors of the Adeptus Administratum. Born on a minor hive world in the Segmentum Solar, Vander displayed from an early age the combination of bureaucratic acumen and ruthless pragmatism that would eventually elevate him to the highest echelons of imperial power. His initial career followed the typical path of an ambitious administratum clerk, decades spent mastering the complex regulations and procedures that governed imperial bureaucracy, building networks of allies and subordinates, and gradually accumulating the influence necessary to advance through the hierarchy. Vander's particular genius lay in his understanding of how information flowed through imperial institutions. Unlike many of his contemporaries who focused on accumulating wealth or commanding impressive titles, he concentrated on positioning himself at critical nodes within the administrative network. He cultivated relationships with data scribes, vox operators, and astropathic clerks, the invisible functionaries who actually moved information throughout the Imperium. This network provided him with intelligence about developing situations long before they reached the attention of his superiors, allowing him to position himself advantageously for each new crisis or opportunity. The political landscape of the 36th millennium provided numerous opportunities for an operator of Vander's skills. The Imperium faced constant pressure from external threats, orc-wags, chaos incursions, and tyrannid hive fleets, while internal stability remained precarious due to the competing interests of various imperial institutions. The High Lords of Terra, the council that governed the Imperium in the Emperor's name, frequently found themselves deadlocked by institutional rivalries and conflicting priorities. In this environment, individuals who could broker agreements and facilitate compromise gained disproportionate influence. Vander's ascension within the administratum hierarchy accelerated during a series of administrative crises that plagued the segmentum solar in the early decades of the 36th millennium. Supply chain disruptions caused by warp storms had created shortages of critical materials across dozens of systems, while bureaucratic inefficiencies prevented the rapid redistribution of resources from unaffected regions. Vander positioned himself as the architect of solutions to these problems, developing new administrative procedures that streamlined resource allocation and eliminated redundant oversight mechanisms. These reforms, while effective in addressing immediate crises, also concentrated unprecedented authority in the hands of their creator. Vander's new procedures required extensive coordination between different administrative departments, with his office serving as the central clearinghouse for information and decisions. What appeared to be rational administrative reform was actually a carefully orchestrated power grab that placed Vander at the center of the administratum's operations. The transformation of administrative efficiency into personal power required more than mere bureaucratic maneuvering. Vander understood that lasting authority in the Imperium required ideological justification, and he found this justification in the growing influence of the Adeptus Ministorum. Rather than viewing the Ecclesiarchy as a competing power center, he recognized it as a potential vehicle for his own advancement. His public conversion to fervent imperial faith appeared genuine to contemporary observers, marked by ostentatious displays of piety and generous donations to religious causes. Vander's religious awakening coincided with a period of theological ferment within the Ecclesiarchy itself. Different factions within the religious hierarchy promoted competing interpretations of imperial doctrine, from the austere traditionalists who emphasized suffering and sacrifice to more militant groups that advocated for aggressive expansion of imperial territory. Vander positioned himself as a mediator between these factions, using his administrative expertise to resolve practical disputes while avoiding commitment to any particular theological position. This strategy proved remarkably effective in building support across the religious hierarchy. Conservative ecclesiarchs appreciated Vander's emphasis on order and proper procedure, while more radical elements welcomed his willingness to fund their activities and provide administrative support for their initiatives. His ability to speak the language of both bureaucracy and faith made him invaluable to religious leaders who struggled to navigate the complex relationship between spiritual authority and temporal power. The critical moment in Vander's rise came during the succession crisis that followed the death of Ecclesiarch Paulius VII. The religious hierarchy found itself divided between several candidates, each representing different theological and political factions within the Ministorum. Traditional procedures for selecting a new ecclesiarch had become hopelessly complicated by centuries of accumulated precedent and bureaucratic overlay, creating opportunities for manipulation by those who understood the system's intricacies. Vander's intervention in the succession crisis demonstrated his mastery of imperial politics. Rather than supporting any particular candidate, he focused on reforming the selection process itself, proposing new procedures that would ensure a more orderly and efficient transition. These reforms, while appearing neutral and administrative in nature, actually favored candidates who enjoyed broad support across different factions, candidates like Vander himself, who had carefully cultivated relationships throughout the religious hierarchy. The elevation of Goj Vander to the position of ecclesiarch represented a fundamental shift in the nature of religious authority within the Imperium. Previous holders of the office had typically been theologians or spiritual leaders whose authority derived from their perceived holiness or doctrinal expertise. Vander, by contrast, was primarily an administrator whose religious credentials were secondary to his political skills. His appointment signaled the triumph of institutional pragmatism over spiritual authority within the Ecclesiarchy. Vander's consolidation of power accelerated rapidly once he assumed the ecclesiarch's throne. His first major initiative involved the systematic reorganization of religious administration throughout the Imperium, ostensibly designed to improve efficiency and eliminate corruption. These reforms created new oversight mechanisms that reported directly to Vander's office, while simultaneously reducing the autonomy of local religious authorities. Cardinal worlds that had previously enjoyed considerable independence found themselves subject to detailed scrutiny from Terra-based inspectors. The administrative reforms served as cover for a more fundamental transformation of the ecclesiarchy's role within imperial governance. Vander began inserting religious officials into positions traditionally held by purely secular administrators, arguing that spiritual guidance was essential for proper governance. Planetary governors found themselves required to consult with ecclesiarchal representatives on matters ranging from taxation policy to military recruitment. The traditional separation between religious and temporal authority, while never absolute, began to erode under pressure from Vander's expanding influence. The process of consolidating religious and administrative authority culminated in Vander's appointment to the position of Master of the Administratum, making him simultaneously the head of both the Adeptus Ministorum and the Adeptus Administratum. This unprecedented concentration of power in the hands of a single individual represented a fundamental violation of the checks and balances that had traditionally prevented any one person from dominating imperial governance. The other High Lords of Terra, while concerned about this development, found themselves unable to oppose it effectively due to their own institutional rivalries and Vander's careful cultivation of support among their subordinates. The dual authority that Vander now wielded allowed him to implement policies that would have been impossible under the traditional system of divided governance. Religious doctrine became intertwined with administrative regulation in ways that made it difficult to distinguish between spiritual guidance and governmental decree. Citizens who questioned administrative decisions found themselves accused of heresy, while religious dissent was treated as treason against the Imperium itself. Vander's reign marked the beginning of what would later be known as the Reign of Blood, a period characterized by increasingly brutal suppression of dissent and the systematic elimination of potential rivals. The machinery of both religious and secular government was turned toward the identification and destruction of anyone who might threaten Vander's authority. Inquisitors who had traditionally operated independently found themselves subject to ecclesiarchal oversight, while Space Marine chapters that questioned religious doctrine faced accusations of heretical thinking. The establishment of the Daughters of the Emperor represented perhaps the most significant military innovation of Vander's reign. These warriors, recruited from the all-female population of San Lear, combined fanatical religious devotion with exceptional combat skills. Unlike traditional imperial military forces, which maintained at least nominal independence from religious authority, the daughters served as Vander's personal army, answerable only to him and bound by oaths of absolute loyalty. The daughters of the emperor were not merely bodyguards or ceremonial troops, but elite warriors capable of conducting complex military operations across multiple theaters simultaneously. Their training combined traditional combat techniques with intensive religious indoctrination, creating soldiers who viewed their service not as military duty, but as sacred calling. This combination of martial excellence and spiritual fervor made them extraordinarily effective in combat, while their absolute loyalty to Vander made them the perfect instrument for suppressing dissent within the Imperium. The deployment of the daughters throughout imperial space served multiple purposes beyond mere military enforcement. Their presence on worlds experiencing religious or political unrest served as a visible reminder of Vander's power and reach. Local authorities who might have been tempted to resist ecclesiarchal directives found themselves facing the prospect of conflict with warriors whose reputation for ruthless efficiency preceded them. The psychological impact of their presence often proved as effective as their actual combat capabilities in maintaining order. The corruption that characterized Vander's reign extended far beyond mere political authoritarianism to encompass moral and spiritual decay that touched every aspect of imperial society. The fusion of religious and temporal authority created opportunities for abuse that were unprecedented in scope and scale. Religious officials who had traditionally focused on spiritual guidance found themselves wielding secular power over taxation, military recruitment, and judicial proceedings. The temptations inherent in such authority proved too great for many to resist. The systematic corruption of religious institutions under Vander's rule manifested in numerous ways throughout the Imperium. Ecclesiarchal positions were increasingly sold to the highest bidder rather than awarded based on spiritual merit or theological expertise. Religious ceremonies became elaborate displays of wealth and power rather than expressions of faith and devotion. The construction of massive cathedrals and religious monuments consumed resources desperately needed for more practical purposes, while the faithful were subjected to increasingly onerous tithes and taxes justified as necessary for spiritual purification. The moral decay extended beyond institutional corruption to encompass the personal behavior of religious officials throughout the hierarchy. Cardinals and bishops who had once lived lives of austere devotion now surrounded themselves with luxury and excess that would have been scandalous in earlier eras. The theological justifications for this transformation were elaborate and sophisticated, drawing on complex doctrinal arguments about the need for religious leaders to demonstrate the emperor's favor through material prosperity. The impact of this corruption on ordinary imperial citizens was profound and far-reaching. Religious services that had once provided comfort and spiritual guidance became exercises in political indoctrination and financial extraction. Local priests, many of whom had entered religious service from genuine devotion, found themselves forced to implement policies that contradicted their understanding of imperial doctrine. Those who resisted faced accusations of heresy and the prospect of violent retribution from Vander's enforcers. The resistance to Vander's rule began to coalesce around figures who combined religious authority with sufficient independence to challenge the corrupt Ecclesiarchy. Sebastian Thor emerged as the most significant of these opposition leaders, a preacher whose combination of theological expertise and charismatic leadership made him a natural focal point for dissent. Unlike many of Vander's critics, who focused on political or administrative objections to his rule, Thor framed his opposition in explicitly theological terms, arguing that Vander's corruption represented a fundamental betrayal of the imperial faith. Thor's movement gained momentum through his ability to articulate an alternative vision of imperial religion that emphasized the traditional virtues of sacrifice, humility, and service to the emperor. His sermons, which spread throughout the Imperium despite official attempts at suppression, contrasted the simple devotion of ordinary faithful with the elaborate corruption of the official Ecclesiarchy. This message resonated powerfully with populations who had grown increasingly alienated from religious institutions under Vandir's rule. The theological challenge posed by Thor's movement was particularly dangerous to Vandir because it could not be dismissed as mere political opposition or administrative criticism. Thor's arguments were grounded in established imperial doctrine and supported by extensive scriptural evidence, making them difficult to refute through conventional religious authority. The growing support for Thor's position among lower-ranking clergy created the prospect of schism within the Ecclesiarchy itself, threatening the unified religious authority that was essential to Vandir's power. The alliance between Sebastian Thor and Alicia Dominica represented a critical turning point in the struggle against Vandir's rule. Dominica, as the leader of the Daughters of the Emperor, controlled the military force that was essential to Vandir's ability to maintain power through violence and intimidation. Her conversion to Thor's cause was driven not by political calculation, but by genuine religious conviction, as she came to understand that her loyalty to Vandir had led her to betray the very faith she had sworn to serve. The process of Dominica's conversion was gradual and complex, involving extensive theological discussions with Thor and careful examination of imperial doctrine. The warrior saint's decision to abandon Vandir was not made lightly, as it required her to acknowledge that her years of service had been fundamentally misdirected. The psychological and spiritual struggle involved in this transformation was immense, as Dominica was forced to reconcile her absolute loyalty to her oath-sworn master with her growing understanding of his corruption and heresy. The military capabilities that Dominica brought to the alliance were decisive in the eventual overthrow of Vandir's regime. The Daughters of the Emperor, whose loyalty had been transferred from the corrupt Ecclesiarch to the righteous cause of reform, provided the force necessary to breach the defenses of the ecclesiarchal palace on Terra. Their intimate knowledge of Vandir's security arrangements and their unquestioned access to restricted areas made them uniquely capable of reaching the tyrant despite his elaborate precautions. The final confrontation between Vandir and his former protectors was swift and decisive. The man who had wielded unprecedented power over the Imperium's spiritual and temporal affairs found himself defenseless against warriors whose loyalty he had taken for granted. The execution of Goj Vandir marked the end of the most severe internal crisis the Imperium had faced since the Horus Heresy, but it also created the need for fundamental reforms to prevent similar abuses in the future. The Reformation that followed Vandir's death was led by Sebastian Thor, whose theological authority and moral credibility made him the natural choice to rebuild the corrupted Ecclesiarchy. The new Ecclesiarch faced the enormous task of purging the religious hierarchy of Vandir's appointees, while simultaneously maintaining the institutional continuity necessary for effective governance. The process required careful balance between justice and pragmatism, as too aggressive a purge might have crippled the Ecclesiarchy's ability to function, while too lenient an approach might have allowed corruption to persist. The most significant institutional reform implemented during the Reformation was the decree passive, a fundamental limitation on the Ecclesiarchy's military capabilities designed to prevent future concentration of armed force in the hands of religious authorities. This decree specifically prohibited the Adeptus Ministorum from maintaining men under arms, a restriction that eliminated the possibility of another figure like Vandir using religious military forces to dominate imperial governance. The implementation of the decree passive required careful consideration of existing military arrangements within the Ecclesiarchy. The Daughters of the Emperor, whose loyalty had proven decisive in overthrowing Vandir, posed a particular challenge. Their military effectiveness and religious devotion made them valuable assets for the Imperium, but their continued existence as an armed force under ecclesiarchal control would violate the new restrictions. The solution involved their transformation into the Adepta Sororitas, a new organization that maintained their military capabilities while operating under modified command structures that ensured independence from direct ecclesiarchal control. The creation of the Adepta Sororitas represented more than mere administrative reorganization. It established a new model for the relationship between religious devotion and military service within the Imperium. The Sisters of Battle, as they became known, combined the martial excellence of the former daughters with enhanced theological training and expanded operational independence. Their loyalty remained focused on the emperor and the imperial faith, but they were no longer subject to the direct command of ecclesiarchal authorities who might use them for personal or political purposes. The world of Dimammer existed on the periphery of imperial consciousness, a minor agri-world whose primary contribution to the greater Imperium consisted of grain shipments and the occasional tithe of conscripts for the Imperial Guard. Its rolling plains stretched beneath perpetually overcast skies, broken only by the massive combine harvesters that crawled across the landscape like metal insects, gathering the crops that would feed distant hive worlds. The population lived in scattered agricultural settlements, their lives governed by the rhythms of planting and harvest rather than the grand political machinations that shaped the fate of sectors. It was from this unremarkable world that Sebastian Thor emerged, born into a family of grain workers whose ancestors had tilled the same fields for countless generations. His early life followed the predictable pattern of agricultural labor, dawn rising to tend the massive thrashing machines, long days spent monitoring crop yields and soil conditions, evenings devoted to the maintenance of equipment that meant the difference between prosperity and starvation. The young Thor displayed no obvious signs of the charismatic leadership that would eventually reshape the Imperium's spiritual landscape. The transformation began during Thor's adolescence, when a routine inspection by ecclesiarchal tax assessors revealed the brutal reality of Vander's corruption at the local level. The visiting clergy demanded tribute far beyond the world's capacity to provide, threatening orbital bombardment if their requirements were not met. The local priest, an elderly man who had served the community faithfully for decades, attempted to negotiate a reduction in the demanded tithe, arguing that compliance would leave the population facing starvation through the coming winter. The ecclesiarchal representatives responded to this reasonable request with accusations of heresy and sedition. The old priest was publicly executed in the settlement's central square, his body left hanging as a warning to others who might question the wisdom of their spiritual superiors. The brutality of this act, carried out in the name of the emperor whom Thor had been taught to revere, created a crisis of faith that would drive his subsequent theological development. Thor's response to this trauma was not rejection of imperial doctrine, but intensive study of its fundamental principles. He began collecting and analyzing religious texts, comparing the actions of Vander's representatives with the teachings they claimed to represent. This scholarly approach to theology was unusual for someone of his background, but Thor possessed an analytical mind that could penetrate the complexities of doctrinal interpretation with remarkable clarity. The young preacher's understanding of imperial theology developed through years of careful study and contemplation. He recognized that the corruption he witnessed was not inherent to the faith itself, but represented a fundamental perversion of its core principles. The emperor's message, as Thor understood it, emphasized sacrifice for others rather than exploitation of the weak, humility in the face of divine mystery rather than arrogant displays of temporal power, and service to humanity rather than personal aggrandizement. Thor's first sermons were delivered to small gatherings of agricultural workers in the fields around his home settlement. His message was simple but powerful. The current ecclesiarchy had betrayed the faith it claimed to serve, replacing the emperor's teachings with a corrupt parody that served only the interests of those in power. These early speeches combined theological sophistication with the plain-spoken language of working people, making complex doctrinal arguments accessible to audiences who had never received formal religious education. The power of Thor's preaching lay not in rhetorical flourishes or dramatic gestures, but in his evident sincerity and deep understanding of imperial doctrine. He could quote extensively from the Lectitio Divinitatis and other foundational texts, demonstrating that his criticism of the current ecclesiarchy was grounded in established theological principles rather than personal grievance or political ambition. This scholarly foundation gave his arguments a weight and credibility that purely emotional appeals could never have achieved. Word of the young preacher's extraordinary abilities spread throughout Dimammer's agricultural communities through the informal networks that connected scattered settlements. Workers traveling between farms carried reports of Thor's sermons to distant regions, while merchant caravans brought news of his growing reputation to other worlds in the system. The message resonated powerfully with populations who had experienced similar abuses at the hands of corrupt religious authorities. The growth of Thor's movement beyond Dimammer occurred through the same channels that had initially spread his reputation. Pilgrims began arriving on the agricultural world specifically to hear his teachings, then returned to their homeworlds carrying copies of his sermons and theological treatises. These texts were hand-copied and distributed through underground networks that operated beneath the notice of official authorities, creating a grassroots theological movement that transcended planetary boundaries. Thor's theological innovations focused on returning imperial doctrine to what he argued were its original principles. He emphasized the emperor's role as protector and guide rather than demanding master, arguing that true faith manifested through service to others rather than submission to corrupt authority. This interpretation drew heavily on the earliest imperial religious texts, particularly those sections of the Lectitio Divinitatis that emphasized the emperor's sacrifice for humanity's benefit. The preacher's understanding of martyrdom differed significantly from the official ecclesiarchal position that had developed under Vander's influence. Where the corrupt hierarchy taught that suffering was valuable in itself, Thor argued that sacrifice was meaningful only when it served a greater purpose. The emperor's agony upon the golden throne was sacred because it protected humanity from the predations of chaos, not because suffering was inherently virtuous. This theological distinction had profound practical implications for how the faithful should conduct their lives. Thor taught that the hardships endured by ordinary imperial citizens were not automatically spiritually beneficial, but became sacred only when they contributed to the greater good of humanity. This interpretation provided a framework for criticizing the systematic oppression that characterized life under Vander's rule, while maintaining loyalty to the fundamental principles of imperial faith. The spread of Thor's movement throughout the Imperium created increasing concern among Vander's supporters, who recognized the theological challenge it represented to their authority. Unlike purely political opposition, which could be dismissed as treasonous ambition, Thor's arguments were grounded in established religious doctrine and supported by extensive scriptural evidence. This made them difficult to refute through conventional ecclesiastical authority. Vander's response to the growing Thor movement involved both direct persecution and attempts at theological counter-argument. Ecclesiarchal authorities published lengthy treatises attempting to refute Thor's interpretations of imperial doctrine, while simultaneously ordering the arrest of anyone found possessing copies of his writings. These efforts proved largely ineffective, as Thor's arguments were too well grounded in established theology to be easily dismissed, while persecution only enhanced his reputation as a righteous opponent of corruption. The turning point in Thor's struggle against Vander came through his alliance with Alicia Dominica, the leader of the Daughters of the Emperor. This relationship developed through a series of theological discussions that occurred when Dominica was dispatched to suppress Thor's movement on Dimammer. Rather than simply arresting the preacher, Dominica engaged with his arguments, seeking to understand the theological basis for his opposition to the ecclesiarchy she served. These conversations revealed to Dominica the extent to which her loyalty to Vander had led her to betray the very faith she had sworn to protect. Thor's careful analysis of imperial doctrine demonstrated that the actions she had carried out in Vander's name contradicted the fundamental principles of the religion she claimed to serve. This realization created a profound spiritual crisis that ultimately led to her conversion to Thor's cause. The alliance between Thor and Dominica combined theological authority with military capability in a way that made effective resistance to Vander's rule possible for the first time. Thor provided the intellectual and spiritual framework for opposition, while Dominica commanded the armed force necessary to translate that opposition into concrete action. The combination proved irresistible to populations throughout the Imperium who had grown increasingly alienated from the corrupt Ecclesiarchy. The campaign that led to Vander's overthrow was carefully planned and executed with the precision that characterized Dominica's military operations. Rather than attempting a direct assault on Terra, the alliance focused on systematically undermining Vander's support throughout the Imperium. Worlds that had remained loyal to the corrupt Ecclesiarch found themselves facing both theological arguments that undermined the legitimacy of his rule and military pressure from the reformed daughters of the emperor. The final assault on the ecclesiarchal palace demonstrated the effectiveness of combining religious authority with military expertise. Dominica's intimate knowledge of the palace's defenses, gained through years of service as Vander's protector, allowed her forces to penetrate security arrangements that would have stopped conventional attackers. The sight of the daughters of the emperor turning against their former master sent shockwaves throughout the imperial hierarchy, demonstrating that even Vander's most trusted supporters had abandoned him. The execution of Goj Vander marked the end of the most severe internal crisis the Imperium had faced since the Horus Heresy, but it also created the need for fundamental institutional reforms to prevent similar abuses in the future. Thor, elevated to the position of Ecclesiarch in recognition of his role in overthrowing the tyrant, faced the enormous task of rebuilding the corrupted Adeptus Ministorum while maintaining its essential functions within imperial governance. The purification of the Ecclesiarchy required careful balance between justice and pragmatism. Too aggressive a purge of Vander's appointees might have crippled the religious hierarchy's ability to function, while too lenient an approach could have allowed corruption to persist. Thor's solution involved the establishment of new oversight mechanisms that could identify and remove corrupt officials while preserving institutional continuity. The theological reforms implemented during Thor's tenure as Ecclesiarch focused on returning imperial doctrine to what he argued were its original principles. The elaborate theological justifications that had been developed to support Vander's excesses were systematically dismantled and replaced with interpretations that emphasized service, humility, and sacrifice for the greater good. These changes were codified in new religious texts that were distributed throughout the Imperium to ensure uniform understanding of proper doctrine. The establishment of the Synod Ministra represented the most significant administrative innovation of Thor's Reformation. This body, composed of senior clergy from throughout the Imperium, was designed to provide oversight of ecclesiarchal activities and prevent the concentration of power that had enabled Vander's tyranny. The Synod's members were selected through a complex process that balanced theological expertise with administrative competence, ensuring that the body could effectively monitor religious institutions while maintaining the spiritual authority necessary for its decisions to be respected. The formal codification of imperial religious hierarchy during Thor's tenure created a standardized structure that could function effectively across the diverse worlds of the Imperium. Previous arrangements had developed organically over centuries, creating a complex patchwork of local traditions and competing authorities that made coordinated action difficult. Thor's reforms established clear lines of authority and responsibility that eliminated much of the confusion and conflict that had characterized earlier periods. The doctrinal codification undertaken during the Reformation involved the systematic compilation and analysis of religious texts that had accumulated over millennia of imperial history. Thor's scholars worked to identify authentic expressions of imperial faith while eliminating the corruptions and distortions that had crept in over time. This process required extensive knowledge of theological history and the ability to distinguish between legitimate doctrinal development and self-serving innovation. The most significant military reform implemented during Thor's tenure was the Decree Passive, which prohibited the Adeptus Ministorum from maintaining men under arms. This restriction was specifically designed to prevent future concentration of military force in the hands of religious authorities who might use it to dominate imperial governance. The decree represented a fundamental limitation on ecclesiarchal power that would shape the relationship between religious and temporal authority for millennia to come. The transformation of the daughters of the emperor into the Adepta Sororitas represented the practical implementation of the decree passive's restrictions. The new organization maintained the military effectiveness of the former daughters, while operating under modified command structures that ensured independence from direct ecclesiarchal control. This arrangement preserved valuable military assets while preventing their use for personal or political purposes by corrupt religious authorities. The creation of the orders militant within the Adepta Sororitas established a new model for the relationship between religious devotion and military service. These organizations combined intensive theological training with advanced combat instruction, creating warriors who understood their military service as a form of religious devotion. The Sisters of Battle who emerged from this training were not merely soldiers who happened to be religious, but theologian warriors whose understanding of imperial doctrine informed every aspect of their military operations. Thor's canonization as a saint following his death represented the ultimate validation of his theological and administrative reforms. The process of canonization involved extensive investigation of his life and teachings by ecclesiastical authorities who sought to verify that his actions and beliefs conformed to established standards of sanctity. The unanimous approval of his canonization demonstrated the extent to which his reforms had been accepted throughout the religious hierarchy. The institutional changes implemented during Thor's Reformation proved remarkably durable, shaping the development of the Adeptus Ministorum for the subsequent 10 millennia. The oversight mechanisms he established continued to function effectively in preventing the concentration of power that had enabled Vander's tyranny. The theological principles he codified became the foundation for all subsequent doctrinal development within the imperial faith. The legacy of Sebastian Thor's Reformation extended far beyond the immediate crisis that had prompted it. The emphasis on service and sacrifice that characterized his theological teachings became deeply embedded in imperial culture, influencing everything from military doctrine to administrative policy. The institutional safeguards he established created a framework for religious governance that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining essential continuity with established tradition. The institutional framework that emerged from Sebastian Thor's Reformation created a religious hierarchy of unprecedented complexity and reach, designed to govern the spiritual lives of countless billions across the galaxy, while preventing the concentration of power that had enabled Vander's tyranny. At the apex of this vast ecclesiastical machine sits the Ecclesiarch, whose authority over imperial religious affairs is absolute, yet carefully circumscribed by the safeguards Thor established. The position carries immense responsibility, as the Ecclesiarch must balance the spiritual needs of humanity against the practical demands of governing a galaxy-spanning empire while maintaining doctrinal purity in the face of countless local variations and interpretations. The selection of each new ecclesiarch follows procedures established during the Reformation, involving extensive consultation with the Holy Synod of Terra and careful evaluation of candidates' theological credentials, administrative competence, and moral character. Unlike the corrupt processes that had elevated Vander to power, these procedures emphasize spiritual authority over political maneuvering, though the realities of imperial governance ensure that practical considerations remain significant factors in the selection process. Candidates typically emerge from the ranks of cardinal-level clergy who have demonstrated exceptional ability in managing complex religious hierarchies while maintaining doctrinal orthodoxy. The Holy Synod of Terra serves as both advisory council and oversight mechanism for the ecclesiarch's authority, comprising senior clergy drawn from throughout the Imperium who represent different theological traditions and regional perspectives. This body meets in regular session within the vast cathedral complexes of Terra, where representatives from cardinal worlds and major shrine worlds gather to debate doctrinal questions, coordinate religious policy across sectors, and provide guidance on matters affecting the broader imperial faith. The synod's deliberations often extend for months, as representatives must consider how theological decisions will affect populations separated by vast distances and diverse cultural traditions. The relationship between the Ecclesiarch and the Holy Synod reflects the careful balance of authority that Thor's reforms established. While the Ecclesiarch retains ultimate decision-making power over religious matters, the Synod's influence ensures that major policy changes receive input from clergy who understand local conditions throughout the Imperium. This arrangement prevents the isolation that had allowed previous ecclesiarchs to lose touch with the realities facing ordinary believers while maintaining the unified authority necessary for effective religious governance. Cardinal worlds represent the highest tier of ecclesiastical authority below Terra itself, serving as regional centers of religious administration that coordinate ecclesiarchal activities across multiple sectors. These worlds are typically ancient centers of imperial faith, often sites of significant religious events or locations where particularly revered saints lived and died. The transformation of a world into cardinal status involves extensive ceremonial processes that formally recognize its spiritual significance while establishing the administrative infrastructure necessary for its expanded role in religious governance. The cardinals who govern these worlds wield authority that extends far beyond their immediate planetary domains, overseeing religious activities across entire subsectors and coordinating with other cardinal worlds to ensure doctrinal consistency across vast regions of space. Their responsibilities include the appointment of lower-ranking clergy, the oversight of religious education programs, the coordination of pilgrimage routes, and the management of the vast resources that flow through ecclesiastical institutions. Each cardinal maintains extensive bureaucratic apparatus staffed by thousands of clerks, scribes, and administrators who handle the practical details of religious governance. The selection and training of cardinals requires decades of preparation, as these positions demand both deep theological knowledge and sophisticated understanding of imperial politics. Potential cardinals typically begin their careers as ordinary priests or missionaries, demonstrating exceptional ability in spreading the imperial faith and managing religious communities. Their advancement through the ecclesiastical hierarchy involves progressively more complex assignments that test their ability to handle theological disputes, administrative challenges, and the delicate relationships between religious and secular authority. Shrine worlds occupy a distinct position within the ecclesiastical hierarchy, representing locations of such profound religious significance that their entire existence revolves around maintaining and protecting sacred sites. Unlike cardinal worlds, which serve primarily administrative functions, shrine worlds are dedicated to preserving the physical locations where saints performed miracles, martyrs died for the faith, or other events of theological importance occurred. The populations of these worlds often consist primarily of pilgrims, religious scholars, and the support staff necessary to maintain the massive cathedral complexes and shrine cities that dominate their landscapes. The governance of shrine worlds presents unique challenges that require specialized administrative approaches. The constant influx of pilgrims from throughout the Imperium creates logistical demands that strain planetary resources, while the need to maintain sacred sites in pristine condition requires enormous investments in preservation technology and skilled craftsmen. The religious authorities who oversee these worlds must balance accessibility for legitimate pilgrims against the security concerns created by large populations of transient visitors from diverse backgrounds. The territorial organization of ecclesiastical authority follows patterns established during the early centuries of imperial expansion, with modifications introduced during Thor's Reformation to improve coordination and prevent corruption. Each sector of imperial space contains multiple ecclesiastical provinces overseen by archdeacons who report to the relevant cardinal authority. These provinces typically encompass dozens of star systems, with individual worlds assigned to the oversight of senior preachers who coordinate local religious activities and ensure compliance with broader ecclesiastical policies. The practical implementation of this territorial system requires extensive communication networks that can function despite the challenges of interstellar travel and the unreliable nature of astropathic communication. Ecclesiastical authorities maintain their own courier services using specially blessed spacecraft crewed by devout pilots who view their service as religious duty rather than mere transportation work. These vessels carry religious edicts, theological treatises, and administrative directives throughout imperial space, ensuring that even the most remote worlds remain connected to the broader ecclesiastical hierarchy. Archdeacons serve as crucial intermediaries within the ecclesiastical hierarchy, translating the broad policy directives issued by cardinal authorities into specific programs that can be implemented at the local level. Their territories typically span multiple star systems, requiring them to understand the diverse cultural and economic conditions that affect religious practice across different worlds. An archdeacon overseeing worlds in an industrial sector must address very different challenges than one responsible for agricultural regions or frontier territories threatened by Xenos incursions. The administrative responsibilities of archdeacons include the oversight of religious education programs that ensure proper understanding of imperial doctrine among local populations. These programs must be adapted to local conditions while maintaining doctrinal consistency, requiring sophisticated understanding of both theological principles and practical pedagogy. Archdeacons work closely with planetary governors and other secular authorities to integrate religious instruction into broader educational systems while maintaining the independence necessary for proper spiritual guidance. The appointment and training of archdeacons follows rigorous procedures designed to ensure both theological competence and administrative capability. Candidates typically emerge from the ranks of successful preachers who have demonstrated ability to manage complex religious communities while maintaining doctrinal orthodoxy. Their preparation for higher office involves extensive study of ecclesiastical law, administrative procedures, and the theological principles that guide religious governance throughout the Imperium. Preachers represent the backbone of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, serving as the primary interface between the institutional ecclesiarchy and ordinary imperial citizens. Their responsibilities encompass everything from conducting regular religious services to providing spiritual guidance during times of crisis, from overseeing local religious education to coordinating with secular authorities on matters affecting their communities. The effectiveness of the entire ecclesiastical system depends on the competence and dedication of these local religious leaders. The training of preachers varies considerably across different regions of the Imperium, reflecting local traditions and the diverse challenges faced by religious communities in different environments. Candidates from hive worlds must learn to address the spiritual needs of massive urban populations living in cramped and polluted conditions, while those destined for frontier worlds need training in survival skills and the ability to establish religious communities in hostile environments. Despite these variations, all preacher training emphasizes thorough grounding in imperial doctrine and the practical skills necessary for effective religious leadership. The daily responsibilities of preachers extend far beyond conducting religious ceremonies to encompass a wide range of social services that the Ecclesiarchy provides to imperial communities. They often serve as mediators in local disputes, advisors to families facing difficult decisions, and coordinators of charitable activities that provide assistance to the poor and disadvantaged. This multifaceted role requires preachers to develop skills in counseling, administration, and community organization that complement their theological training. Missionaries occupy a specialized position within the ecclesiastical hierarchy, tasked with spreading the imperial faith to populations that have had limited exposure to orthodox doctrine. Their work often takes them to frontier worlds where imperial authority is newly established, to regions where heretical beliefs have taken root, or to communities that have been isolated from mainstream imperial culture for extended periods. The challenges they face require exceptional dedication and specialized training that prepares them for operating in hostile or unfamiliar environments. The preparation of missionaries involves intensive study of comparative theology that enables them to understand and counter various forms of heretical belief they may encounter in their work. They must learn to identify the theological errors that characterize different heretical movements while developing the rhetorical skills necessary to persuade populations to abandon false beliefs in favor of orthodox imperial doctrine. This training often includes practical instruction in survival skills, basic medical knowledge, and the ability to establish religious communities in challenging circumstances. The work of missionaries often requires them to operate with minimal support from the broader ecclesiastical hierarchy, making independent decisions about how to adapt imperial doctrine to local conditions while maintaining essential theological principles. This independence creates both opportunities and risks, as effective missionaries can achieve remarkable success in spreading the faith, while those who lack proper grounding in doctrine may inadvertently promote heretical interpretations of imperial belief. The relationship between the Adeptus Ministorum and other imperial institutions reflects the complex balance of authority that characterizes imperial governance. The Ecclesiarchy's spiritual authority gives it significant influence over other institutions, while its dependence on secular authorities for resources and military protection creates relationships of mutual dependence that must be carefully managed. The specific nature of these relationships varies considerably depending on local conditions and the personalities of the individuals involved. The interaction between ecclesiastical and secular authorities at the planetary level often determines the effectiveness of imperial governance in addressing the diverse challenges facing human civilization. Planetary governors who maintain good relationships with local ecclesiarchal representatives can draw on religious authority to legitimize their policies and mobilize popular support for necessary but unpopular measures. Conversely, conflicts between religious and secular authorities can paralyze planetary administration and create opportunities for heretical movements to exploit divisions within imperial leadership. The Inquisition maintains particularly complex relationships with the Ecclesiarchy, as both institutions share responsibility for identifying and eliminating heretical threats to imperial orthodoxy. Inquisitors possess authority that transcends normal ecclesiastical hierarchy, allowing them to investigate and prosecute even senior clergy suspected of heretical activity. However, the Ecclesiarchy's deep knowledge of theological matters and extensive networks of local contacts make it an invaluable ally in identifying subtle forms of doctrinal deviation that might escape notice by secular investigators. The practical cooperation between inquisitorial and ecclesiarchal authorities often involves joint operations that combine the Inquisition's investigative capabilities with the Ecclesiarchy's theological expertise and local knowledge. These collaborations can be highly effective in identifying and eliminating heretical movements, but they also create potential for conflict when inquisitors and clergy disagree about the appropriate response to suspected heresy. The resolution of such disputes often requires intervention by higher authorities from both institutions. The financial relationships between the Ecclesiarchy and other imperial institutions reflect the enormous resources required to maintain religious activities across the galaxy. The Adeptus Ministorum receives funding through a complex system of tithes, donations, and direct appropriations from imperial coffers, while also generating revenue through its own economic activities. The management of these resources requires sophisticated financial administration that can track income and expenditures across thousands of worlds, while ensuring that funds are used for legitimate religious purposes. The Ecclesiarchy's economic activities extend far beyond simple fundraising to encompass substantial involvement in interplanetary trade, manufacturing, and resource extraction. Many shrine worlds and cardinal worlds operate extensive commercial enterprises that generate revenue to support religious activities while providing employment for local populations. These economic activities must be carefully managed to ensure they serve religious rather than purely commercial purposes, requiring oversight by ecclesiastical authorities with both theological and business expertise. The military relationships between the Ecclesiarchy and other imperial institutions reflect the restrictions imposed by the decree passive, while acknowledging the reality that religious institutions face constant threats from heretical movements, Xenos incursions, and other dangers. The Adepta Sororitas serves as the primary military arm of the Ecclesiarchy, providing protection for religious sites and personnel, while maintaining the independence from direct ecclesiastical control required by Thor's reforms. The coordination between the Adepta Sororitas and other imperial military forces requires careful attention to command relationships and operational objectives. Sisters of Battle often operate alongside Imperial Guard regiments and Space Marine forces in campaigns against heretical movements or Xenos threats, but their primary loyalty remains to the Emperor and the Imperial faith rather than to secular military commanders. This arrangement can create tensions when military and religious objectives conflict, requiring skilled leadership to resolve disputes and maintain operational effectiveness. The transformation of Goj Vander's personal bodyguard into the Emperor's most devoted warriors represents one of the most remarkable reversals in Imperial history. The Daughters of the Emperor originated on the remote world of San Lear, a planet whose harsh conditions and rigid martial culture produced warriors of exceptional skill and unwavering discipline. Vander discovered this world during his consolidation of power, recognizing in its all-female warrior societies the perfect combination of martial prowess and fanatical loyalty that he required for his personal protection. San Lear's unique cultural development had created a civilization where warfare was considered the exclusive domain of women, with elaborate traditions governing their training, equipment, and deployment in battle. The planet's constant tribal conflicts had refined these warrior traditions over millennia, producing fighters whose skills rivaled those of Imperial Guard veterans despite their primitive technology. When Vander's agents arrived on San Lear, they found a world where the concept of absolute loyalty to a supreme leader was already deeply embedded in the cultural consciousness. The recruitment process that transformed San Lear's tribal warriors into the Daughters of the Emperor involved extensive conditioning that combined their existing martial traditions with intense religious indoctrination. Vander's agents selected the most promising candidates from various tribes, bringing them to specially constructed training facilities where they underwent years of preparation for their new role. The training regimen emphasized not just combat skills, but absolute devotion to Vander personally, whom they were taught to view as the Emperor's chosen representative on Terra. The Daughters' equipment reflected Vander's determination to create a force that could match any threat to his authority. They were armed with the finest weapons the Imperium could produce, including power armor systems adapted specifically for their physiology and combat doctrine. Their signature weapons included blessed bolters, power swords consecrated in elaborate religious ceremonies, and flamers that they wielded with devastating effectiveness against heretical opponents. The visual impact of their distinctive armor, painted in deep crimson and decorated with religious iconography, served both practical and psychological purposes in establishing their reputation throughout the Imperium. The organizational structure of the Daughters reflected military traditions adapted from San Lear's tribal warfare, modified to serve the needs of galaxy-spanning operations. Small squads of warriors formed the basic tactical unit, with each member trained to fulfill multiple roles depending on mission requirements. These squads could operate independently for extended periods, making them ideal for the diverse assignments that Vander's expanding authority required. The flexibility of their organization allowed them to function equally well as ceremonial guards, urban warfare specialists, or assault troops in conventional military operations. Alicia Dominica emerged as the undisputed leader of the Daughters through a combination of exceptional combat skills and natural leadership ability that transcended the rigid hierarchies of San Lear's tribal system. Her rise to prominence occurred during the early years of the Daughters' service, when her tactical brilliance and unwavering devotion to duty earned recognition from both her fellow warriors and Vander himself. Under her leadership, the daughters developed from a collection of individual fighters into a cohesive military organization capable of complex operations across multiple theaters simultaneously. The deployment of the daughters throughout the Imperium during Vandir's reign served multiple strategic purposes beyond mere personal protection. Their presence on worlds experiencing religious or political unrest provided visible demonstration of Vandir's power, while simultaneously gathering intelligence about local conditions and potential threats. The psychological impact of their arrival often proved as effective as their actual combat capabilities, as local populations had learned to associate their distinctive armor with swift and brutal retribution against any who opposed the Ecclesiarch's will. The daughters' combat doctrine emphasized close quarters, fighting, and rapid assault tactics that maximized the impact of their superior training and equipment. They specialized in urban warfare and the assault of fortified positions, developing techniques that allowed small units to overcome numerically superior opponents through superior firepower and tactical coordination. Their training included extensive instruction in the use of specialized equipment such as jump packs and grappling gear that enabled them to reach objectives that would be inaccessible to conventional forces. The religious indoctrination that accompanied the daughters' military training created warriors who viewed their service not as mere employment, but as sacred calling. They were taught elaborate theological frameworks that justified their absolute loyalty to Vandir, while positioning their military service as a form of worship directed toward the emperor. This religious dimension of their identity made them extraordinarily resistant to corruption or subversion, as any challenge to their loyalty was automatically interpreted as heretical blasphemy, deserving violent response. The crisis that led to the daughters' eventual transformation began when Alicia Dominica encountered Sebastian Thor during a mission to suppress his growing religious movement on Dimammer. Rather than simply arresting the preacher as ordered, Dominica found herself drawn into theological discussions that challenged the foundations of her loyalty to Vandir. Thor's careful analysis of imperial doctrine revealed contradictions between the faith she had sworn to protect and the actions she had carried out in Vandir's name. These conversations with Thor created a profound spiritual crisis for Dominica, as she was forced to confront the possibility that her years of faithful service had been fundamentally misdirected. The warrior who had never questioned her loyalty to Vandir found herself examining the theological basis for that loyalty and discovering that it rested on corrupted interpretations of imperial doctrine. The realization that she had been serving not the emperor, but a false prophet who had perverted the faith for personal gain created anguish that transcended mere political disillusionment. The process of Dominica's conversion was gradual and painful, involving extensive study of theological texts and careful examination of her own actions in light of authentic imperial doctrine. She began to understand that true loyalty to the emperor required opposition to those who corrupted his teachings, even when those individuals claimed religious authority. This theological awakening was accompanied by growing awareness among other daughters that their service to Vandir had led them to betray the very faith they had sworn to protect. The alliance between Dominica and Thor represented a convergence of military capability and religious authority that posed an existential threat to Vandir's continued rule. Thor provided the theological framework that justified resistance to the corrupt Ecclesiarch, while Dominica commanded the military force necessary to translate that resistance into effective action. The combination proved irresistible to populations throughout the Imperium who had grown increasingly alienated from Vandir's regime, but lacked the means to oppose it effectively. The campaign that culminated in Vandir's overthrow demonstrated the tactical sophistication that the daughters had developed during their years of service. Rather than attempting a direct assault on Terra, Dominica coordinated a systematic campaign that undermined Vandir's support throughout the Imperium while preparing for the final confrontation. The daughters' intimate knowledge of imperial security procedures and their unquestioned access to restricted areas made them uniquely capable of gathering intelligence and positioning themselves for decisive action. The final assault on the ecclesiarchal palace showcased the combat effectiveness that had made the daughters such valuable assets during Vander's reign. Their coordinated attack penetrated multiple layers of security through a combination of superior firepower, tactical surprise, and intimate knowledge of the palace's layout. The sight of Vander's own protectors turning against him sent shockwaves throughout the imperial hierarchy and demonstrated the extent to which his corruption had alienated even his most trusted supporters. The execution of Goj Vander by the very warriors he had created to protect him marked the end of the age of apostasy, but it also created the need for fundamental reforms to prevent similar abuses in the future. The daughters of the emperor, having proven their loyalty to the true faith through their decisive action against the corrupt ecclesiarch, required new organizational structures that would preserve their military effectiveness while ensuring their independence from direct ecclesiastical control. Sebastian Thor's implementation of the decree passive created the legal framework that necessitated the transformation of the daughters into a new organization. The decree's prohibition against the ecclesiarchy maintaining men under arms was carefully worded to address the specific threat that Vander's control of military forces had represented. The daughters, being women, technically fell outside the decree's restrictions, but Thor recognized that their continued existence as an armed force under direct ecclesiastical control would violate the spirit, if not the letter, of his reforms. The solution involved the creation of the Adepta Sororitas as an independent organization that maintained the daughters' military capabilities while operating under modified command structures. This new arrangement preserved their value as elite warriors while ensuring they could never again be used by corrupt religious authorities to dominate imperial governance. The transformation required careful attention to legal details and organizational structures that would satisfy both the letter and spirit of the decree passive. The establishment of the Order's Militant represented the practical implementation of this organizational transformation. These new structures combined the military traditions of the former daughters with enhanced theological training and expanded operational independence. The orders were designed to function as autonomous military organizations whose loyalty remained focused on the emperor and the imperial faith rather than on any individual ecclesiastical authority. The Order of Our Martyred Lady emerged as the premier fighting force among the newly established Order's Militant, inheriting the traditions and many of the personnel from Alicia, Dominica's original command structure. The Order's distinctive black and white color scheme reflected their role as the Emperor's instruments of justice, while their iconography emphasized themes of sacrifice and redemption that connected their military service to broader theological principles. The Order's battle sisters underwent intensive training that combined advanced combat techniques with deep study of imperial doctrine, creating warriors who understood their military operations as expressions of religious devotion. The Order of the Bloody Rose developed from a different tradition within the former daughters, emphasizing aggressive assault tactics and close-quarters combat that reflected their origins among San Lear's most ferocious tribal warriors. Their distinctive red and black armor served both practical and symbolic purposes, providing excellent protection while announcing their willingness to shed blood in service to the Emperor. The Order's combat doctrine emphasized rapid deployment and overwhelming firepower, making them particularly effective in urban warfare and the assault of fortified positions. The sacred duties of the Adepta Sororitas extended far beyond conventional military operations to encompass a wide range of responsibilities that reflected their unique position within imperial society. As the military arm of the Ecclesiarchy, they served as protectors of religious sites, guardians of sacred relics, and enforcers of doctrinal orthodoxy throughout the Imperium. Their presence at major religious ceremonies provided both security and visible demonstration of the faith's military power, while their participation in pilgrimages and other religious activities reinforced the connection between martial prowess and spiritual devotion. The purging of heretics represented perhaps the most critical of the sisters' sacred duties, requiring both military skill and theological knowledge to identify and eliminate threats to imperial orthodoxy. Unlike conventional military forces, which focused primarily on destroying enemy capabilities, the sisters approached heretic hunting as a form of spiritual warfare that required understanding of the theological errors they sought to eliminate. Their training included extensive instruction in recognizing various forms of heretical belief and the appropriate responses to different types of doctrinal deviation. The protection of the faithful involved both direct military action against external threats and more subtle forms of intervention designed to strengthen religious communities against corruption. Sisters often served as advisors to local religious authorities, providing guidance on security matters while monitoring for signs of heretical infiltration. Their presence in religious communities served as both deterrent to potential heretics and source of inspiration for faithful citizens who saw in them the embodiment of the emperor's protection. The acts of faith that distinguished the Adepta Sororitas from conventional military forces represented manifestations of divine power that transcended normal understanding of cause and effect. These miraculous interventions occurred during moments of extreme crisis when the sisters' faith reached such intensity that it seemed to attract direct intervention from the emperor himself. Witnesses described phenomena that defied rational explanation: bolter rounds that never missed their targets, armor that turned aside attacks that should have been fatal, and weapons that blazed with holy fire that consumed heretical opponents while leaving the faithful unharmed. The theological interpretation of these acts of faith became a subject of intense study among ecclesiarchal scholars who sought to understand the mechanism by which divine power manifested through mortal agents. Some argued that the sisters' extraordinary devotion created a direct connection to the emperor's will that allowed his power to flow through them during critical moments. Others suggested that their faith was so pure that it could influence the warp itself, creating localized effects that appeared miraculous to outside observers. The practical impact of the acts of faith on battlefield operations was undeniable, regardless of their theological explanation. Sisters who experienced these divine interventions reported sensations of overwhelming peace and certainty that guided their actions with supernatural precision. Their weapons seemed to fire with impossible accuracy, their movements became preternaturally swift and sure, and their resolve hardened to the point where no earthly force could shake their determination. These experiences reinforced the sisters' understanding of their role as instruments of divine will, while providing tangible evidence of the emperor's continued involvement in human affairs. The manifestation of acts of faith required specific conditions that combined extreme crisis with absolute faith and pure intention. Sisters could not simply invoke divine intervention through ritual or prayer, but had to achieve a state of spiritual clarity that transcended normal consciousness. This typically occurred during moments when their devotion to the emperor and their determination to protect the faithful reached such intensity that personal considerations disappeared entirely, leaving only the pure desire to serve the divine will. The unique connection between the Adepta Sororitas and the Emperor's divine will set them apart from all other imperial military forces, creating an organization that functions simultaneously as elite fighting force and religious institution. Their training combined the most advanced military techniques with intensive theological education that prepared them to serve as both warriors and spiritual leaders. This dual nature made them invaluable assets in campaigns against heretical movements, where their ability to counter theological arguments proved as important as their combat skills in achieving victory. The spiritual geography of the Imperium extends far beyond mere administrative boundaries to encompass a vast network of sacred sites that serve as focal points for human devotion across the galaxy. These locations, ranging from the ultimate pilgrimage destination of Terra itself to humble battlefield shrines on forgotten frontier worlds, create a complex web of religious significance that binds together the scattered populations of humanity through shared faith and common purpose. The maintenance and protection of these sites represents one of the Adeptus Ministorum's most critical responsibilities, requiring enormous resources and careful coordination between ecclesiastical authorities, secular governments, and military forces throughout imperial space. Terra stands as the ultimate destination for every faithful imperial citizen, its very name capable of inspiring profound religious emotion among believers who may never have the opportunity to visit the sacred throne world. The planet's transformation from the Emperor's secular capital into humanity's greatest shrine began during the dark years following the Horus Heresy, when desperate populations sought tangible connections to their divine protector. Every structure associated with the Emperor's mortal life became the focus of intense veneration, from the laboratories where he conducted his earliest genetic experiments to the command centers from which he directed the Great Crusade. The imperial palace itself has evolved into a vast cathedral complex that dwarfs any other religious structure in human history. The original fortress monastery that served as the emperor's residence during the Great Crusade has been expanded over 10 millennia into a sprawling metropolis of shrines, chapels, and ceremonial halls that covers most of the Himalayan mountain range. Countless billions of pilgrims have contributed to this construction through their labor, their donations, and often their lives, as the palace's expansion continues despite the enormous casualties inflicted by Terra's hostile environment and the constant threats that target the throne world. The Golden Throne itself remains the most sacred site within the palace complex, though access is restricted to the highest levels of imperial hierarchy and the Adeptus Custodes who maintain their eternal vigil. The chamber housing the life support systems that sustain the Emperor's physical form has become the center of elaborate ritual observances conducted by the most senior members of the Ecclesiarchy. These ceremonies, performed according to traditions that have accumulated over millennia, serve both practical and spiritual purposes, maintaining the complex machinery that keeps the Emperor's body functioning while providing opportunities for the faithful to demonstrate their devotion through participation in sacred rites. The approaches to the Golden Throne follow carefully prescribed routes that take pilgrims through a series of preparatory chambers designed to purify their souls before encountering the divine presence. These chambers contain relics from every period of imperial history, from fragments of the Emperor's original armor to soil samples from worlds he personally liberated during the Great Crusade. The progression through these spaces creates a profound psychological and spiritual experience that prepares visitors for the overwhelming reality of standing in the presence of their living God. The countless shrines dedicated to the Emperor's glory throughout the palace complex reflect the diverse ways in which different populations understand and express their devotion. Some focus on his role as the master of mankind, emphasizing his leadership during humanity's expansion among the stars. Others venerate him as the ultimate warrior, displaying weapons and armor associated with his legendary battles against the forces of chaos. Still others celebrate his role as protector and guide, featuring elaborate altars where the faithful can offer prayers for divine intervention in their daily struggles. The Sanctum Imperialis represents the most accessible of the palace's major shrines, designed to accommodate the massive crowds of pilgrims who journey to Terra from throughout the galaxy. This vast cathedral can hold over 1 million worshippers simultaneously, its soaring architecture creating acoustic effects that amplify prayers and hymns into overwhelming expressions of collective devotion. The chamber's walls display murals depicting scenes from imperial history, from the Emperor's first emergence from obscurity through the triumph of Sebastian Thor's Reformation, creating a visual narrative that reinforces orthodox theological interpretations of these events. The Shrine of the Primarchs occupies a particularly poignant position within the palace complex, commemorating the Emperor's lost sons who fell during the Horus Heresy or disappeared in the millennia that followed. Each loyal Primarch is represented by elaborate monuments that celebrate their contributions to the Imperium while mourning their absence from humanity's ongoing struggle. The shrine serves as a focal point for prayers requesting the return of these legendary figures, as many believers maintain faith that the Emperor will eventually recall his sons to lead humanity in its darkest hour. Beyond the palace walls, Terra's surface contains thousands of smaller shrines and religious sites that commemorate specific events in imperial history or venerate particular aspects of the Emperor's divine nature. The site where Horus fell during the final battle of the Heresy has become a massive memorial complex where visitors can contemplate the tragedy of the War Master's betrayal and the price of the Emperor's victory. The laboratories where the first Space Marines were created now serve as shrines to human genetic purity, while the launch platforms that dispatched the Great Crusade fleets have been transformed into monuments to humanity's manifest destiny among the stars. The administrative challenges of managing pilgrimage traffic to Terra require sophisticated coordination between multiple imperial institutions. The Adeptus Ministorum maintains extensive bureaucracies dedicated to processing pilgrimage applications, arranging transportation, and providing accommodation for visitors from throughout the galaxy. The sheer scale of these operations strains even the Imperium's vast resources, as millions of pilgrims arrive on Terra each year, many of whom have spent their entire life savings on the journey and require extensive support during their stay. The security arrangements necessary to protect Terra's sacred sites reflect the constant threats facing the throne world from heretical movements, alien infiltrators, and chaos cultists who would seek to corrupt or destroy humanity's most important religious centers. The Adeptus Custodes maintain primary responsibility for the palace complex itself, while the Adepta Sororitas provide security for many of the secondary shrines throughout the planet. These forces work closely with the Inquisition to identify potential threats among the pilgrim populations, a task complicated by the genuine religious fervor that characterizes most visitors to the sacred world. Ophelia 7 stands as the most significant religious center outside Terra itself, serving as the seat of ecclesiarchal power and the primary training ground for clergy destined to serve throughout the galaxy. The world's transformation into a cardinal world began during the early centuries following Sebastian Thor's Reformation, when the growing Adeptus Ministorum required administrative centers that could coordinate religious activities across vast regions of space. Ophelia 7's strategic location in the Segmentum Solar made it an ideal choice for this role, while its existing religious infrastructure provided the foundation for rapid expansion. The planet's surface is dominated by massive cathedral cities that house the various departments and institutions of the Ecclesiarchy's central administration. The Cathedral of St. Thor serves as the primary seat of the Cardinal, who governs Ophelia 7, its towering spires visible from orbit, and its vast halls capable of accommodating the thousands of clergy who gather for major religious ceremonies. The structure's architecture combines practical administrative spaces with elaborate ceremonial areas, reflecting the dual nature of the Ecclesiarchy as both spiritual institution and governmental bureaucracy. The Schola Progenium facilities on Ophelia 7 represent some of the most important educational institutions in the Imperium, responsible for training the orphaned children of imperial servants who will eventually assume positions of authority throughout human space. These schools combine rigorous academic instruction with intensive religious education, creating graduates who understand their future roles as expressions of service to the Emperor rather than mere career opportunities. The curriculum emphasizes both practical skills necessary for effective administration and the theological knowledge required to maintain doctrinal orthodoxy in diverse cultural environments. The Seminary of the Sacred Heart serves as the primary training center for clergy destined to serve on cardinal and shrine worlds throughout the galaxy. The institution's programs combine theological education with practical instruction in the administrative skills necessary for managing complex religious hierarchies. Students undergo years of intensive study that covers everything from comparative theology and ecclesiastical law to resource management and diplomatic protocol, preparing them for the diverse challenges they will face as senior religious authorities. The Convent Sanctorum on Ophelia 7 houses one of the largest concentrations of Adepta Sororitas outside Terra itself, serving as both training facility and operational base for orders militant operating throughout the Segmentum Solar. The complex includes advanced combat training facilities, armories containing some of the finest weapons and equipment available to Imperial forces, and chapels where the sisters can maintain their spiritual discipline between missions. The presence of so many elite warriors on Ophelia 7 provides security for the planet's religious institutions, while serving as a visible reminder of the Ecclesiarchy's military capabilities. The Archives Sanctus represent one of the most valuable resources maintained by the Ecclesiarchy, containing copies of religious texts, theological treatises, and historical documents from throughout imperial history. These vast libraries preserve not only orthodox imperial doctrine, but also records of various heretical movements that have been defeated over the millennia, providing invaluable resources for scholars and inquisitors seeking to understand and combat new forms of doctrinal deviation. The archives collections include original manuscripts dating back to the Great Crusade era, many of which contain information that has been lost from other imperial records. The significance of cardinal worlds in regional religious governance extends far beyond their role as administrative centers to encompass their function as sources of doctrinal interpretation and theological innovation within carefully defined orthodox boundaries. Each cardinal world develops its own particular emphasis within imperial doctrine, reflecting the cultural and historical circumstances of its region while maintaining essential unity with the broader imperial faith. These regional variations provide flexibility that allows the Ecclesiarchy to address diverse local conditions while preserving the fundamental principles that unite all imperial believers. The cardinal world of Maceria serves as the primary religious center for the Segmentum Pacificus, its vast cathedral complexes rising from the ruins of ancient cities destroyed during the world's compliance with imperial rule. The planet's religious traditions emphasize themes of redemption and purification through suffering, reflecting the harsh conditions that characterize much of the Segmentum Pacificus and the constant threats from alien species that inhabit the region. The Cardinal of Maceria oversees religious activities across dozens of sectors, coordinating with military commanders and planetary governors to ensure that imperial doctrine supports the practical needs of frontier defense. The influence of cardinal worlds over local imperial creed interpretations operates through complex networks of religious authority that connect major administrative centers with smaller religious communities throughout their regions. Cardinals maintain extensive correspondence with archdeacons, preachers, and local religious authorities, providing guidance on theological questions while monitoring for signs of doctrinal deviation that might require intervention. This system allows for considerable local variation in religious practice while maintaining the oversight necessary to prevent the emergence of heretical movements. The theological seminaries maintained by cardinal worlds serve as important sources of religious education for clergy destined to serve in their regions, ensuring that local religious authorities understand both orthodox imperial doctrine and the particular interpretations that have developed to address regional conditions. These institutions compete with each other to attract the most promising candidates, creating a system that encourages theological excellence while maintaining healthy diversity within orthodox boundaries. Graduates of these seminaries often develop strong loyalties to their training institutions that influence their subsequent careers and theological positions. The economic resources controlled by cardinal worlds enable them to fund extensive missionary activities that spread imperial doctrine to newly discovered worlds or regions where heretical beliefs have taken root. These missions often operate for decades or even centuries, gradually establishing religious infrastructure and training local clergy who can maintain orthodox doctrine after the missionaries move on to new assignments. The success of these efforts depends heavily on the ability of cardinal worlds to provide sustained support for long-term projects that may not show immediate results. Lesser pilgrimage sites throughout the Imperium serve as focal points for local devotion that complement the galaxy-spanning significance of major shrine worlds and cardinal worlds. These locations, often associated with the lives and deaths of minor saints or significant events in local imperial history, provide opportunities for religious expression that are accessible to populations who lack the resources for major pilgrimages to distant worlds. The maintenance of these sites requires coordination between local religious authorities and secular governments, as their protection often depends on military forces that have competing demands on their resources. Saints' tombs represent perhaps the most common form of lesser pilgrimage site, marking the burial places of individuals whose lives exemplified particular virtues or who died in circumstances that demonstrated exceptional devotion to the emperor. The process of establishing these sites involves extensive investigation by ecclesiarchal authorities who must verify both the historical facts surrounding the potential saint's life and the theological significance of their actions. Once approved, these tombs become centers of local religious activity that can attract pilgrims from throughout the surrounding region. The tomb of Saint Celestine on the world of Sanctus lies exemplifies the transformation of a battlefield death into a site of enduring religious significance. The location where the living saint fell during her battle against chaos forces has become a massive shrine complex that attracts millions of pilgrims each year. The site's architecture incorporates elements from the original battlefield, including preserved sections of the fortifications where Celestine made her final stand, creating a powerful connection between the physical location and the spiritual significance of her sacrifice. Battlefield shrines serve a particularly important role in maintaining imperial identity among military forces and civilian populations in frontier regions where the Imperium's hold remains tenuous. These sites commemorate victories against alien species, successful defenses against chaos incursions, or other military actions that demonstrated the emperor's protection of his faithful servants. The establishment of battlefield shrines often occurs immediately after significant military actions, as commanders recognize their value in maintaining morale and reinforcing the religious dimensions of imperial military service. The Shrine of the Last Stand on Cadia marked the location where Imperial Guard regiments made their final defense against the 13th Black Crusade, transforming a site of military defeat into a symbol of imperial determination and sacrifice. Before the planet's destruction, millions of pilgrims visited the shrine to honor the memory of those who died defending the Cadian Gate, while military units used the site for ceremonial purposes that reinforced their commitment to similar sacrifice if necessary. The shrine's destruction, along with Cadia itself, has created new forms of veneration focused on portable relics and memorial sites established on other worlds. The maintenance of lesser pilgrimage sites requires different approaches than those used for major shrine worlds, as local resources and security capabilities often prove insufficient for protecting sites that attract significant pilgrim traffic. The Adeptus Ministorum has developed specialized programs that provide support for these locations while respecting local autonomy and cultural traditions. These programs often involve the deployment of small contingents of clergy or Adepta Sororitas, who can provide security and religious guidance while training local personnel to assume long-term responsibility for site maintenance. The economic impact of pilgrimage activities on local communities can be substantial, as visiting pilgrims require food, accommodation, transportation, and various religious services during their stays. Many worlds have developed entire economic sectors dedicated to supporting pilgrimage activities, from specialized transportation services that can handle the unique requirements of religious travelers to craftsmen who produce religious artifacts and souvenirs that pilgrims carry back to their home worlds. The management of these economic relationships requires careful attention to ensure that commercial considerations do not compromise the spiritual significance of pilgrimage sites. The integration of lesser pilgrimage sites into broader networks of religious authority helps ensure that local devotional practices remain consistent with orthodox imperial doctrine, while allowing for the cultural variations that make these sites meaningful to their particular communities. Archdeacons and other regional religious authorities maintain regular contact with the clergy responsible for these sites, providing guidance on theological questions and monitoring for signs of doctrinal deviation that might require intervention. This oversight system allows the Ecclesiarchy to maintain control over religious expression while preserving the local character that makes these sites effective focal points for community devotion. The protection of pilgrimage sites from various threats requires coordination between religious authorities, local security forces, and imperial military units that may be operating in the region. Chaos cultists often target religious sites for corruption or destruction, while alien species may view them as symbols of human expansion that must be eliminated. The defensive arrangements for these sites must balance accessibility for legitimate pilgrims against security concerns, often requiring sophisticated screening procedures and the maintenance of rapid response capabilities that can address emerging threats. The elevation of mortal humans to sainthood within the imperial faith represents one of the most complex and carefully regulated processes in the Adeptus Ministorum's theological framework. Unlike the ancient Terran religions that preceded the imperial creed, where divine status might be claimed through political maneuvering or popular acclaim, the canonization of imperial saints requires extensive investigation by specialized ecclesiarchal tribunals that examine every aspect of a candidate's life, death, and posthumous influence. This rigorous process, established during Sebastian Thor's Reformation to prevent the kind of corruption that had characterized Vander's reign, ensures that only those individuals who truly exemplify the highest virtues of imperial faith achieve recognition as saints. The initial stages of canonization begin at the local level, where communities that have witnessed extraordinary acts of devotion or miraculous events petition their regional ecclesiarchal authorities for recognition of a potential saint. These petitions must be accompanied by detailed documentation of the candidate's life, including witness testimonies, historical records, and evidence of any miraculous phenomena associated with their actions. The burden of proof rests entirely on the petitioners, who must demonstrate not only that the candidate lived a life of exceptional virtue, but that their example continues to inspire faithful service to the emperor among those who remember them. The theological criteria for sainthood encompass multiple dimensions of spiritual excellence that reflect the complex nature of imperial doctrine. Candidates must demonstrate unwavering faith in the emperor's divinity, absolute loyalty to the Imperium and its institutions, and extraordinary courage in the face of threats to humanity's survival. Beyond these basic requirements, potential saints must exhibit specific virtues that serve as examples for other imperial citizens, whether through exceptional military service, profound theological insight, miraculous healing abilities, or the capacity to inspire others to greater devotion through their words and actions. The investigation process conducted by ecclesiarchal tribunals involves teams of specialized clergy who possess expertise in historical research, theological analysis, and the detection of supernatural phenomena. These investigators travel to locations associated with the candidate's life, interviewing witnesses, examining physical evidence, and conducting detailed analysis of any claimed miracles or divine interventions. The process often takes decades to complete, as investigators must verify the authenticity of historical claims while distinguishing between genuine miraculous events and natural phenomena that might appear supernatural to untrained observers. The verification of miracles presents particular challenges for canonization tribunals, as they must apply rigorous standards of evidence while remaining open to the possibility of genuine divine intervention. Claimed miracles undergo extensive investigation that includes consultation with medical experts, analysis of physical evidence, and careful examination of witness testimonies for consistency and credibility. The tribunals distinguish between different types of miraculous phenomena, from healing miracles that demonstrate the candidate's connection to the emperor's power to protective miracles that show divine intervention in moments of extreme danger. The documentation requirements for canonization proceedings create vast archives of testimony and evidence that serve as valuable historical resources for understanding the development of imperial faith across different worlds and time periods. These records preserve detailed accounts of local religious practices, cultural variations in imperial doctrine, and the ways in which ordinary citizens have responded to extraordinary circumstances. The accumulated testimonies provide insight into the daily spiritual lives of imperial citizens that might otherwise be lost to history. Saint Celestine stands as perhaps the most celebrated example of imperial sainthood, her story embodying the transformation of mortal devotion into divine power that characterizes the highest expressions of imperial faith. Born on the shrine world of Ophelia 7, Celestine entered the Adepta Sororitas as a young woman driven by absolute commitment to protecting the faithful from the predations of chaos. Her early service with the Order of Our Martyred Lady demonstrated exceptional combat skills and unwavering courage, but it was her capacity for inspiring others that marked her as extraordinary even among the elite warriors of the sisterhood. Celestine's first recorded miracle occurred during the defense of the shrine city of Sanctus Lies against a massive chaos incursion led by demon princes of the ruinous powers. As imperial forces faced overwhelming odds and their defensive lines began to collapse, Celestine experienced what witnesses described as a divine transformation that filled her with supernatural power and radiant light. Her bolter round struck with impossible accuracy, her power sword blazed with holy fire that could cleave through demon flesh, and her presence alone was sufficient to drive lesser demons back into the warp. The battle at Sanctus Lies became legendary throughout the Imperium, not only for Celestine's miraculous intervention, but for the way her example inspired the defending forces to achieve victory against impossible odds. Imperial Guard regiments that had been on the verge of routing rallied at the sight of her luminous figure advancing against the demon horde, while civilian populations that had been paralyzed by terror found the courage to take up arms in defense of their homes. The psychological impact of her presence proved as important as her supernatural combat abilities in turning the tide of battle. The theological significance of Celestine's transformation extends beyond the immediate military victory to encompass broader questions about the nature of divine power and its manifestation through mortal agents. Ecclesiarchal scholars have debated for centuries whether her abilities represent a permanent change in her fundamental nature or temporary divine possession that allows the emperor's power to flow through her during moments of extreme crisis. The distinction carries important implications for understanding the relationship between human devotion and divine intervention within imperial doctrine. Celestine's subsequent appearances throughout imperial history have followed a consistent pattern of manifestation during humanity's darkest hours, when chaos forces threaten to overwhelm imperial defenses and the survival of entire worlds hangs in the balance. Her interventions typically occur at critical moments when conventional military forces have reached the limits of their capabilities, providing both supernatural combat power and the inspirational leadership necessary to rally desperate defenders. These appearances have been documented across multiple sectors and time periods, creating a body of evidence that supports her unique status among imperial saints. The physical description of Celestine during her divine manifestations has remained remarkably consistent across different witness accounts, despite the vast distances and time periods separating her various appearances. Observers describe a figure of supernatural beauty surrounded by golden light, her power armor gleaming with inner radiance and her weapons blazing with holy fire. The wings of pure energy that extend from her shoulders allow her to move across battlefields with impossible speed, while her voice carries across the din of combat with clarity that reaches every defender regardless of distance or intervening obstacles. The theological debates surrounding Celestine's nature reflect broader questions about the mechanisms through which the Emperor's power manifests in the material universe. Some scholars argue that she represents a unique form of divine avatar, a mortal soul so perfectly aligned with the Emperor's will that it can serve as a direct conduit for his power. Others suggest that her appearances represent a form of resurrection, with the Emperor calling her spirit back from death whenever humanity faces existential threats that require her intervention. Saint Sabbat occupies a different but equally significant position within the pantheon of imperial saints, her story demonstrating how local devotion can evolve into galaxy-spanning veneration through the power of example and the careful cultivation of religious tradition. Unlike Celestine, whose sainthood was established through dramatic miraculous interventions, Sabbat achieved recognition through a lifetime of quiet service that exemplified the virtues of humility, sacrifice, and unwavering faith in the Emperor's protection. The world of Hadja, where Sabbat lived and died, had been recently incorporated into the Imperium when she began her religious career as a simple missionary tasked with spreading imperial doctrine among populations that retained strong attachments to their pre-imperial spiritual traditions. The challenge of converting these communities required not just theological knowledge, but profound understanding of human psychology and the ability to present imperial doctrine in ways that addressed local spiritual needs while maintaining doctrinal orthodoxy. Sabbat's approach to missionary work emphasized personal example rather than formal preaching, demonstrating through her own actions the virtues that imperial doctrine promoted. She worked alongside the populations she sought to convert, sharing their hardships and providing practical assistance with agricultural problems, medical needs, and community disputes. This hands-on approach created relationships of trust and respect that made her theological teachings more credible and compelling than formal religious instruction might have achieved. The miracles associated with Saint Sabbat were typically small-scale events that addressed immediate local needs rather than the dramatic battlefield interventions that characterized Celestine's manifestations. Witnesses reported instances of supernatural healing, the ability to locate water in drought-stricken regions, and protection from natural disasters that threatened agricultural communities. These miracles served practical purposes that improved the daily lives of ordinary citizens, while demonstrating the Emperor's concern for the welfare of his faithful servants. The development of Sabbat's cult following occurred gradually over decades, as stories of her compassion and miraculous abilities spread throughout Hadja and eventually to neighboring worlds. Local communities began establishing shrines at locations associated with her ministry, while pilgrims traveled increasing distances to seek her blessing for their various afflictions and concerns. The organic growth of her veneration provided a model for how authentic religious devotion could develop without the artificial promotion that had characterized some of the false saints promoted during Vandire's corrupt reign. Sabbat's martyrdom occurred during a chaos incursion that threatened to corrupt the very populations she had spent her life converting to imperial faith. Rather than fleeing to safety, she remained with the communities under attack, using her spiritual authority to organize resistance against the heretical forces while providing comfort and guidance to civilians caught in the conflict. Her death came while defending a group of children from chaos cultists, her final act demonstrating the ultimate expression of selfless service that imperial doctrine promoted. The investigation of Sabbat's life and miracles by ecclesiarchal authorities revealed the profound impact her ministry had achieved in establishing stable imperial religious communities throughout her region. The populations she had converted demonstrated remarkable resistance to chaos corruption, their faith providing psychological and spiritual protection against the insidious influence of the ruinous powers. This practical demonstration of imperial doctrine's protective power provided compelling evidence for her canonization and established precedents for evaluating the effectiveness of missionary work in subsequent canonization proceedings. The phenomenon of living saints represents the most extraordinary manifestation of divine power within the imperial faith, occurring when individuals achieve such perfect alignment with the Emperor's will that they become direct conduits for his intervention in mortal affairs. Unlike conventional saints, who are venerated after their deaths, living saints manifest supernatural abilities during their lifetimes, serving as visible proof of the Emperor's continued involvement in humanity's struggle for survival. The rarity of these manifestations makes them objects of intense theological study and popular devotion throughout the Imperium. The transformation into a living saint appears to occur during moments of extreme crisis, when an individual's faith reaches such intensity that it transcends normal human limitations. Witnesses describe a process of divine possession or elevation that fundamentally alters the subject's physical and spiritual nature, granting abilities that far exceed normal human capabilities. These transformations typically occur during combat situations where the future of entire worlds or populations hangs in the balance, suggesting that the Emperor's intervention manifests most readily when the stakes are highest. The abilities demonstrated by living saints consistently include enhanced physical capabilities that allow them to survive wounds that would kill ordinary humans, supernatural accuracy with weapons that enables them to strike targets at impossible ranges, and the capacity to inspire others to extraordinary acts of courage and devotion. Many living saints also display healing abilities that can cure diseases and injuries through touch, while their presence alone can drive back demon manifestations and protect nearby allies from chaos corruption. The theological implications of living saints extend beyond their immediate military value to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of divine power and its relationship to human faith. Their existence provides tangible evidence that the Emperor continues to actively intervene in mortal affairs despite his confinement to the Golden Throne, while their human origins demonstrate that extraordinary devotion can bridge the gap between mortal and divine nature. This theological framework encourages all imperial citizens to strive for greater faith and devotion, holding out the possibility that their own dedication might eventually merit divine recognition. The documentation of living saint manifestations requires careful attention to distinguishing between genuine divine intervention and various forms of deception or corruption that might mimic supernatural abilities. Chaos forces have been known to create false saints whose apparent miracles serve to spread heretical influence among imperial populations, while certain Xeno species possess psychic abilities that could be mistaken for divine power by untrained observers. Ecclesiarchal investigators must therefore apply rigorous standards of evidence while remaining open to the possibility of authentic divine manifestation. The veneration of martyrs within imperial doctrine serves multiple theological and practical purposes that reflect the harsh realities of life in the 41st millennium. The constant threats facing human civilization ensure that death in service to the Emperor is a common experience for imperial citizens, from soldiers dying in forgotten wars on distant worlds to workers perishing in industrial accidents that maintain the Imperium's vast infrastructure. The theological framework surrounding martyrdom transforms these deaths from meaningless tragedies into sacred sacrifices that contribute to humanity's spiritual as well as physical survival. The criteria for recognizing martyrdom extend beyond simple death in imperial service to encompass the circumstances and motivations that characterize the individual's final actions. True martyrs must demonstrate conscious choice to sacrifice their lives for the greater good rather than mere accidental death during the performance of duty. The theological distinction emphasizes the importance of intentional sacrifice and willing acceptance of suffering as expressions of faith rather than simple misfortune or poor judgment. The process of suffering that precedes martyrdom receives particular emphasis in imperial theology, as the endurance of pain and hardship is understood to purify the soul and strengthen its connection to the Emperor's own suffering upon the Golden Throne. Martyrs who face prolonged torture or gradual death while maintaining their faith provide especially powerful examples of spiritual strength that inspire other imperial citizens to endure their own trials with similar courage and determination. The theological importance of suffering within imperial doctrine reflects the fundamental reality that human existence in the 41st millennium involves constant hardship and danger that must be endured rather than avoided. The doctrine of redemptive suffering provides meaning for the grinding oppression that characterizes daily life for most imperial citizens, transforming their endurance of harsh conditions from mere survival into active participation in the Emperor's divine plan for humanity's salvation. The veneration of martyrs creates powerful psychological and social bonds that unite imperial communities around shared values and common purpose. Local martyrs whose stories are known throughout their regions provide accessible examples of virtue that ordinary citizens can understand and emulate, while the broader pantheon of galaxy-spanning martyrs creates connections between distant populations who share similar challenges and aspirations. This network of shared veneration helps maintain imperial unity across the vast distances and cultural differences that might otherwise fragment human civilization. The practical applications of martyr veneration extend beyond spiritual comfort to encompass military morale, social cohesion, and resistance to heretical influence. Military units that maintain strong traditions of honoring their fallen comrades demonstrate greater resilience in combat and higher levels of unit cohesion, while civilian populations with well-developed martyr cults show increased resistance to chaos, corruption, and alien influence. The psychological protection provided by these traditions serves as a form of spiritual armor that complements the physical defenses that protect imperial territory. The constant vigilance required to maintain doctrinal purity across the galaxy's countless worlds creates an environment where heretical movements can emerge from the most unexpected sources, often taking root within the very institutions designed to prevent their spread. The Adeptus Ministorum's vast bureaucratic structure, while essential for coordinating religious activities across such enormous distances, also creates opportunities for corruption and doctrinal deviation that require constant monitoring and periodic purging. The complexity of imperial theology, with its countless saints, regional variations, and accumulated traditions spanning 10 millennia, provides fertile ground for misinterpretation and deliberate distortion by those who would exploit religious authority for personal gain or ideological purposes. The plague of unbelief stands as perhaps the most devastating internal crisis to afflict the Ecclesiarchy since the age of apostasy, demonstrating how theological disputes can escalate into galaxy-spanning conflicts that threaten the very foundations of imperial unity. The crisis began in the 35th millennium with the emergence of Cardinal Bucharest, whose charismatic preaching and apparent miracles attracted massive followings across multiple sectors of imperial space. Bucharest proclaimed a radical reinterpretation of imperial doctrine that emphasized immediate salvation through faith rather than the traditional emphasis on suffering and sacrifice, promising his followers that true believers would be spared the hardships that characterized life in the Imperium. The theological innovations promoted by Bucharest appeared superficially orthodox, drawing extensively from established imperial texts while subtly altering their interpretation in ways that fundamentally changed their meaning. His sermons emphasized passages from the Lectitio Divinitatis that described the emperor's love for humanity, while downplaying sections that discussed the necessity of struggle and sacrifice. This selective interpretation created a version of imperial faith that promised earthly rewards for devotion rather than spiritual purification through suffering, appealing powerfully to populations exhausted by centuries of grinding hardship. The spread of Bucharest's movement occurred through the same ecclesiastical networks that normally served to maintain doctrinal orthodoxy throughout the Imperium. His appointed representatives carried his teachings to distant worlds, establishing new religious communities that practiced modified versions of imperial ritual while maintaining the outward appearance of orthodox devotion. Local clergy who questioned these innovations found themselves marginalized or removed from their positions, replaced by Bucharest's supporters, who gradually transformed entire planetary religious hierarchies according to the Cardinal's theological vision. The military dimension of the plague of unbelief emerged when Bucharest began recruiting armed followers who viewed themselves as the emperor's chosen warriors destined to purify the Imperium of false doctrine and corrupt leadership. These forces, drawn primarily from planetary defense forces and imperial guard units stationed in regions under Bucharest's influence, combined fanatical religious devotion with sophisticated military training that made them formidable opponents for loyalist forces. The Cardinal's ability to inspire such dedication among professional soldiers demonstrated the profound psychological appeal of his theological message. The response to Bucharest's growing influence revealed the complex relationships between different imperial institutions and the challenges inherent in combating heretical movements that operate within established religious frameworks. The Inquisition faced particular difficulties in investigating the Cardinal's activities, as his theological innovations remained technically within the bounds of orthodox interpretation, while his political support among local populations made direct action potentially catastrophic for imperial unity in affected regions. The delicate balance between maintaining doctrinal purity and preserving social stability required careful coordination between multiple agencies. The military campaigns that eventually suppressed the plague of unbelief consumed enormous resources and resulted in the devastation of entire sectors as loyalist forces struggled to distinguish between genuine heretics and populations that had been misled by Bucharest's teachings. The conflict demonstrated the vulnerability of imperial institutions to charismatic leaders who could exploit legitimate grievances and theological ambiguities to build powerful alternative power structures. The eventual victory came only after years of brutal warfare that left lasting scars on the affected regions and prompted significant reforms in ecclesiastical oversight procedures. The Apostles of the Blind King represent a different but equally dangerous form of heretical movement, one that emerged from within the ranks of the Ecclesiarchy's most trusted servants and spread through careful infiltration rather than open rebellion. The movement's origins trace back to a group of senior clergy who became convinced that the emperor's confinement to the Golden Throne represented not sacrifice but imprisonment, and that true faith required working to free him from what they perceived as technological bondage. This fundamental misunderstanding of the emperor's condition led to theological innovations that directly contradicted core imperial doctrine while maintaining the appearance of orthodox devotion. The blind king himself remains a mysterious figure whose true identity has never been definitively established by imperial investigators. Some evidence suggests he was originally a cardinal-level cleric with access to restricted theological texts and ancient technological archives, while other sources indicate he may have been a rogue tech priest who developed heretical interpretations of the relationship between flesh and machine. Regardless of his origins, the blind king demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both imperial theology and the psychological techniques necessary to recruit followers from among the Ecclesiarchy's most dedicated servants. The recruitment methods employed by the apostles relied heavily on exploiting the genuine spiritual struggles experienced by clergy who witnessed the suffering of imperial citizens while maintaining faith in the emperor's benevolence. The movement's recruiters identified priests and missionaries who showed signs of theological doubt or emotional exhaustion, approaching them with seemingly orthodox discussions about the nature of divine suffering and the proper response to the emperor's condition. These conversations gradually introduced heretical concepts disguised as deeper theological insights, leading vulnerable clergy to embrace beliefs that fundamentally contradicted their original training. The operational structure of the apostles reflected careful study of imperial security procedures and the communication networks that connected ecclesiastical institutions throughout the galaxy. The movement organized itself into small cells that maintained minimal contact with each other, reducing the risk of complete exposure if individual members were discovered by imperial authorities. Each cell operated with considerable independence while following general directives that promoted the movement's theological agenda through subtle influence rather than direct confrontation with orthodox institutions. The theological innovations promoted by the apostles focused on reinterpreting the emperor's relationship with technology and the nature of his continued existence upon the Golden Throne. The movement taught that the life support systems maintaining the emperor's physical form were actually preventing his spiritual ascension to full godhood, and that destroying these technological constraints would allow him to achieve his true divine potential. This doctrine provided theological justification for sabotage activities targeting imperial infrastructure while maintaining the appearance of devotion to the emperor's welfare. The discovery of apostle infiltration within major ecclesiarchal institutions prompted one of the most extensive internal investigations in the Adeptus Ministorum's history, as inquisitorial agents worked with loyal clergy to identify and eliminate heretical influence throughout the religious hierarchy. The investigation revealed the extent to which the movement had penetrated even the highest levels of ecclesiastical authority, with several archdeacons and at least one cardinal found to have been compromised by apostle doctrine. The purges that followed these discoveries disrupted normal ecclesiastical operations for decades, while new oversight procedures were implemented to prevent similar infiltration. The role of the Ordo Hereticus in monitoring and purging corruption within the Adeptus Ministorum represents one of the most delicate and potentially explosive aspects of imperial governance, requiring inquisitors to investigate the very institutions responsible for maintaining humanity's spiritual welfare. The Ordo's authority to prosecute even the highest-ranking clergy creates constant tension between religious and inquisitorial hierarchies, as both institutions claim ultimate responsibility for protecting imperial orthodoxy while operating according to different procedures and priorities. The successful resolution of these tensions requires careful diplomacy and mutual respect between organizations that must work together despite their competing claims to authority. The methods employed by Hereticus inquisitors in investigating ecclesiastical corruption must account for the unique challenges presented by religious institutions, where genuine spiritual devotion can be difficult to distinguish from carefully constructed deception. Heretical clergy often possess sophisticated theological knowledge that allows them to present their innovations as legitimate interpretations of established doctrine, while their positions within religious hierarchies provide them with extensive networks of supporters who may be either willing collaborators or innocent victims of theological manipulation. The investigation process requires specialized training in theological analysis and the psychological techniques used by heretical movements to recruit followers. The Inquisition's surveillance networks within the Ecclesiarchy operate through a combination of formal oversight mechanisms and informal intelligence gathering that must be carefully balanced to avoid undermining legitimate religious authority. Hereticus agents maintain contact with trusted clergy throughout the religious hierarchy, receiving reports about suspicious activities or theological innovations that might indicate heretical influence. These networks provide early warning about emerging threats while preserving the independence necessary for effective religious governance, though the knowledge that such surveillance exists creates ongoing tension within ecclesiastical institutions. The prosecution of heretical clergy requires specialized procedures that account for both the severity of their crimes and the potential impact of their punishment on broader religious communities. High-ranking clergy who are discovered to have promoted heretical doctrine cannot simply be executed without consideration of the theological chaos that might result from the sudden removal of respected religious authorities. The Ordo Hereticus has developed sophisticated approaches that involve public recantation, theological re-education, and carefully managed transitions of authority designed to minimize disruption to affected religious communities while ensuring that heretical influence is completely eliminated. The Wars of Vindication erupted during the 37th millennium when competing interpretations of imperial doctrine regarding the treatment of mutant populations created irreconcilable divisions within the Ecclesiarchy that could not be resolved through normal theological debate. The conflict began when Cardinal of the Segmentum Tempestus proclaimed that certain stable mutations represented divine gifts that enhanced human capability, rather than signs of corruption requiring elimination. This position directly contradicted established doctrine promoted by Cardinal Morvac of the Segmentum Solar, who maintained that any deviation from pure human genetic template constituted heretical corruption that threatened the spiritual integrity of the entire species. The theological dispute initially remained confined to scholarly debates conducted within ecclesiastical institutions, but the practical implications of the competing positions created immediate conflicts in regions where both cardinals held influence. Worlds that had previously maintained stable populations of humans found themselves facing contradictory directives from different ecclesiastical authorities, some ordering the protection of mutant populations, while others demanded their immediate elimination. Local clergy caught between these competing mandates faced impossible choices that threatened to tear apart religious communities regardless of which position they adopted. The military escalation occurred when Cardinal Kryn began deploying fraterist militia units to protect human populations from extermination campaigns ordered by Morvac's supporters, leading to direct armed confrontations between forces that both claimed to be defending orthodox imperial doctrine. The involvement of military units transformed theological disagreement into active warfare that spread across multiple sectors, as local commanders were forced to choose between competing religious authorities. The conflict demonstrated the dangerous potential for doctrinal disputes to fragment imperial unity when they involved practical policies affecting large populations. The resolution of the Wars of Vindication required direct intervention by the High Lords of Terra, who convened an extraordinary theological council that included representatives from both factions, along with neutral clergy from throughout the Imperium. The council's deliberations extended for months as theologians examined scriptural evidence, historical precedents, and the practical implications of different doctrinal positions. The final ruling established nuanced distinctions between different types of mutation that allowed for the protection of stable human populations, while maintaining the principle that genetic purity represented the ideal human condition. The impact of the Wars of Vindication on ecclesiarchal unity extended far beyond the immediate resolution of the mutant question to encompass fundamental reforms in how theological disputes were managed and resolved. The conflict demonstrated the need for more sophisticated mechanisms for handling doctrinal disagreements before they escalated into armed conflict, leading to the establishment of permanent theological review boards with authority to adjudicate disputes between different ecclesiastical authorities. These reforms helped prevent similar conflicts while preserving the theological diversity that allowed the imperial faith to adapt to different local conditions. The establishment of formal heresy trial procedures within the Ecclesiarchy reflects the institution's recognition that internal corruption poses as great a threat to imperial orthodoxy as external enemies. These procedures, developed in cooperation with the Ordo Hereticus, provide standardized methods for investigating suspected heretical activity while protecting the rights of accused clergy and maintaining the integrity of religious institutions. The trials themselves follow elaborate protocols that combine legal procedures with theological examination, ensuring that verdicts reflect both factual evidence and doctrinal analysis. The theological review process that precedes formal heresy trials involves extensive examination of the accused individual's teachings, writings, and recorded statements by panels of senior clergy with expertise in comparative theology and doctrinal interpretation. These reviews seek to distinguish between legitimate theological innovation within orthodox boundaries and genuine heretical deviation that threatens imperial doctrine. The complexity of this analysis requires months or even years of careful study, as reviewers must consider not only the explicit content of suspected heretical teachings, but also their implicit implications and potential effects on broader religious communities. The evidence-gathering procedures used in ecclesiastical investigations must account for the unique challenges presented by religious institutions, where much of the relevant information exists in the form of theological discussions, private counseling sessions, and spiritual guidance that would normally be considered confidential. Investigators must balance the need for thorough examination of suspected heretical activity against respect for the pastoral relationships that form the foundation of effective religious ministry. The resolution of these competing demands requires sophisticated understanding of both investigative techniques and ecclesiastical protocols. The sentencing procedures for convicted heretics reflect the Ecclesiarchy's dual commitment to justice and mercy, seeking to eliminate heretical influence while preserving opportunities for genuine repentance and redemption. Minor doctrinal deviations may result in theological re-education and supervised ministry under the guidance of orthodox clergy, while more serious heretical activity typically requires removal from religious office and extensive penance designed to demonstrate sincere rejection of previous errors. Only the most severe cases, involving deliberate promotion of chaos worship or collaboration with Zeno's enemies, result in execution or other irreversible punishments. The psychological impact of internal conflicts on ordinary clergy and religious communities creates lasting trauma that can undermine faith and effectiveness for generations after the immediate crisis has been resolved. Priests who witness respected colleagues revealed as heretics often struggle with doubt about their own theological understanding and the reliability of religious authority in general. The restoration of confidence in ecclesiastical institutions requires careful attention to pastoral care and community healing that addresses both the practical disruption caused by heretical activity and the deeper spiritual wounds inflicted by betrayal of trust. The development of improved screening procedures for ecclesiastical appointments represents one of the most significant institutional responses to the recurring problem of heretical infiltration within the Adeptus Ministorum. These procedures involve extensive background investigations, psychological evaluation, and theological examination designed to identify potential vulnerabilities that might make candidates susceptible to heretical influence. The screening process also includes ongoing monitoring of clergy performance and regular theological review to detect early signs of doctrinal deviation before they can spread to broader religious communities. The vast machinery of imperial governance relies upon the Adeptus Ministorum not merely as a spiritual authority, but as a fundamental pillar of social order that permeates every aspect of human civilization across the galaxy. The Ecclesiarchy's influence extends far beyond the conduct of religious ceremonies to encompass education, social welfare, moral guidance, and the maintenance of cultural unity among populations separated by unimaginable distances and diverse historical backgrounds. This comprehensive integration of religious authority into the fabric of imperial society creates a system where spiritual devotion and civic duty become indistinguishable, ensuring that loyalty to the emperor manifests through practical service to the Imperium's countless institutions and communities. The maintenance of social order through religious indoctrination begins in the earliest stages of human development, as the Ecclesiarchy operates vast networks of educational institutions that shape the intellectual and spiritual formation of imperial citizens from childhood through adulthood. These schools, ranging from humble village institutions staffed by single priests to massive cathedral academies that serve entire hive cities, provide not only basic literacy and numeracy, but also the theological foundation that enables citizens to understand their place within the emperor's grand design for humanity. The curriculum carefully balances practical skills necessary for productive citizenship with religious instruction that emphasizes duty, sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty to imperial institutions. The standardization of educational content across thousands of worlds requires sophisticated administrative coordination that accounts for local variations in culture and technology while maintaining essential doctrinal consistency. The Ecclesiarchy's educational authorities develop teaching materials that can be adapted to diverse environments, from the cramped recycling centers of hive world undercities to the open agricultural settlements of frontier worlds. These materials emphasize universal themes of imperial identity while allowing for regional variations that make the content relevant to local conditions and cultural traditions. The training of teachers within the Ecclesiarchy's educational system involves extensive preparation in both pedagogical techniques and theological knowledge, ensuring that instructors can effectively communicate complex religious concepts to students of varying ages and backgrounds. Teacher priests undergo years of specialized education that combines practical classroom management skills with deep understanding of imperial doctrine and the ability to recognize and counter heretical influences that might infiltrate educational environments. Their dual role as educators and spiritual guides requires exceptional dedication and broad knowledge that enables them to serve as community leaders beyond their formal teaching responsibilities. The moral guidance provided by the Ecclesiarchy operates through multiple channels that reach every segment of imperial society, from formal counseling services offered by trained clergy to informal spiritual direction provided during daily interactions between priests and their communities. This guidance system addresses the psychological and spiritual needs created by life in the 41st millennium, where ordinary citizens face constant exposure to violence, deprivation, and existential threats that would overwhelm individuals lacking proper spiritual preparation. The Ecclesiarchy's counselors provide frameworks for understanding suffering as meaningful sacrifice rather than meaningless brutality, helping citizens maintain psychological stability in circumstances that might otherwise drive them to despair or madness. The promise of salvation offered by imperial doctrine serves as both comfort for present suffering and motivation for continued service, despite seemingly impossible odds. The theological framework surrounding salvation emphasizes that eternal reward comes not through earthly success, but through faithful service regardless of personal cost, creating psychological resilience that enables imperial citizens to endure hardships that would break populations lacking such spiritual preparation. This promise operates on both individual and collective levels, assuring believers that their personal sacrifices contribute to humanity's eventual triumph, while their communities participate in the Emperor's eternal protection. The administration of imperial holidays creates temporal rhythms that unite scattered populations across the galaxy in synchronized expressions of devotion and imperial identity. The Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, commemorating his assumption of divine status upon the Golden Throne, serves as the most significant celebration in the imperial calendar, marked by elaborate ceremonies that reinforce core theological concepts while providing opportunities for community bonding and collective expression of faith. Local variations in celebration methods allow different worlds to incorporate their cultural traditions while maintaining essential unity in the underlying religious significance of these observances. The Day of Sorrows acknowledges the suffering endured by imperial citizens, while transforming that suffering into sacred participation in the Emperor's own agony upon the Golden Throne. This solemn observance involves fasting, prayer, and acts of penance that demonstrate solidarity with those who have died in imperial service, while strengthening the spiritual resolve of the living. The careful balance between mourning and hope that characterizes these ceremonies helps communities process collective trauma while maintaining the determination necessary for continued resistance against the galaxy's manifold threats. Regional feast days celebrating local saints and martyrs provide opportunities for planetary and sector-level communities to honor their particular heroes while connecting local identity to broader imperial themes. These celebrations often incorporate traditional cultural elements that predate imperial conquest, allowing populations to maintain connections to their ancestral heritage while demonstrating loyalty to imperial authority. The Ecclesiarchy's oversight of these events ensures that local variations remain within orthodox boundaries while preserving the cultural diversity that makes imperial civilization resilient and adaptable. The Ministorum's involvement in charitable activities addresses the material needs of imperial citizens while reinforcing theological messages about service and community responsibility. Ecclesiarchal food distribution centers operate throughout the Imperium, providing basic nutrition to populations facing shortages while creating opportunities for religious instruction and community building. These programs rely heavily on volunteer labor from faithful citizens whose participation demonstrates practical application of imperial virtues while strengthening social bonds that enhance community resilience against external threats. Medical services provided by ecclesiarchal institutions combine practical healthcare with spiritual healing that addresses both physical ailments and the psychological trauma that characterizes life in the 41st millennium. Hospitaller orders within the Adepta Sororitas operate advanced medical facilities that serve both military and civilian populations, while local priests provide basic medical care supplemented by spiritual counseling that helps patients understand their suffering within the broader context of imperial theology. The integration of physical and spiritual healing reflects the Ecclesiarchy's holistic approach to human welfare that recognizes the interconnection between bodily health and spiritual well-being. Orphanages operated by the Ministorum serve the countless children whose parents have died in imperial service, providing not only basic care, but also specialized education that prepares these young people for future service to the Imperium. The Schola Progenium system represents the most prestigious of these institutions, training the children of deceased imperial servants for positions of authority within various imperial organizations. The curriculum combines rigorous academic instruction with intensive physical training and religious education that produces graduates capable of assuming leadership roles while maintaining absolute loyalty to imperial institutions. The spiritual care provided by the Ecclesiarchy encompasses every stage of human life, from blessing ceremonies for newborn children to funeral rites that ensure proper transition from mortal service to eternal communion with the emperor. Birth ceremonies welcome new citizens into the imperial community while establishing their identity as servants of the emperor, destined for lives of faithful service. These rituals create psychological bonds between individuals and the broader imperial community, while providing theological frameworks that give meaning to the challenges and opportunities that await each new generation. Coming-of-age ceremonies mark the transition from childhood dependence to adult responsibility within imperial society, emphasizing the sacred nature of the obligations that citizens accept when they assume full membership in their communities. These ceremonies often involve formal recitation of imperial creeds, demonstration of basic theological knowledge, and public commitment to serve the emperors will in whatever capacity their circumstances require. The community witness to these ceremonies creates social pressure for continued faithful service while providing support networks that help young adults navigate the challenges of imperial citizenship. Marriage ceremonies sanctify the formation of new family units, while emphasizing the role of families in producing and raising future generations of imperial servants. The theological significance of marriage extends beyond personal happiness to encompass the sacred duty of reproduction and child rearing that ensures the continuation of human civilization despite the constant threats that claim countless lives throughout the galaxy. Wedding ceremonies incorporate prayers for fertility, protection, and the strength to endure whatever hardships the couple may face in their service to the Imperium. Funeral rites serve multiple functions within imperial society, providing comfort to the bereaved while reinforcing theological messages about the meaning of death and the continuation of service beyond mortal existence. The ceremonies emphasize that death in imperial service represents not an end but a transformation, as the deceased joins the ranks of honored dead who continue to serve the emperor in spiritual form. This theological framework helps communities process grief while maintaining the determination necessary for continued resistance against threats that require constant sacrifice from each generation. The complex relationship between local planetary cultures and the standardized imperial creed creates ongoing challenges that require sophisticated theological and administrative solutions. The Ecclesiarchy must balance the need for doctrinal consistency across the galaxy against the practical reality that human populations separated by vast distances and different historical experiences will inevitably develop distinct cultural expressions of their faith. This balance requires careful attention to distinguishing between essential theological principles that must remain constant and secondary cultural practices that can vary according to local conditions. approved variations in imperial doctrine typically involve differences in emphasis rather than fundamental disagreements about core theological principles. Some worlds may emphasize the emperor's role as protector and guide, developing elaborate traditions of prayer and petition that seek divine intervention in daily affairs. Others may focus on his nature as the ultimate warrior, creating martial traditions that view military service as the highest expression of religious devotion. Still others may emphasize his sacrifice upon the Golden Throne, developing ascetic practices that seek to share in his suffering through voluntary deprivation and penance. The process of theological syncretism involves the careful integration of pre-imperial cultural elements with orthodox imperial doctrine in ways that strengthen rather than weaken religious authority. Local traditions that can be reinterpreted within imperial theological frameworks are often preserved and incorporated into regional religious practices, providing continuity with ancestral heritage while demonstrating the universal applicability of imperial truth. This process requires extensive consultation between local clergy and higher ecclesiastical authorities to ensure that syncretic practices remain within orthodox boundaries while serving the practical needs of local communities. The monitoring of local variations requires extensive networks of ecclesiastical oversight that can distinguish between legitimate cultural adaptation and dangerous doctrinal deviation. Archdeacons and other regional authorities maintain regular contact with local clergy to assess the theological soundness of regional practices while providing guidance on questions that arise from the interaction between imperial doctrine and local cultural traditions. This oversight system allows for considerable local autonomy while maintaining the central authority necessary to prevent the fragmentation of imperial religious unity. The role of missionaries in establishing imperial religious authority on newly discovered or recently conquered worlds demonstrates the Ecclesiarchy's adaptive capacity in addressing diverse cultural and theological challenges. These specialized clergy undergo extensive training in comparative religion, cultural anthropology, and linguistic analysis that prepares them to understand local belief systems and identify points of connection with imperial doctrine. Their work often extends over decades as they gradually establish religious infrastructure and train local clergy who can maintain orthodox practices after the missionaries move on to new assignments. The educational programs operated by the Ministorum extend beyond basic religious instruction to encompass technical training that prepares citizens for specialized roles within imperial society. Ecclesiarchal technical schools train skilled workers for industries essential to imperial infrastructure, while advanced academies prepare administrators and professionals for positions within various imperial institutions. These programs combine practical instruction with religious education that ensures graduates understand their professional responsibilities as expressions of service to the emperor rather than mere career advancement. The integration of religious instruction into secular educational programs requires careful coordination between ecclesiarchal authorities and other imperial institutions responsible for training specialized personnel. Military academies incorporate religious education that emphasizes the sacred nature of military service and the theological significance of warfare against the emperor's enemies. Technical institutes include instruction in the religious dimensions of their particular specialties, helping students understand how their professional work contributes to the broader spiritual mission of human civilization. The Ministorum's influence on imperial legal systems operates through the provision of moral guidance that supplements secular law with religious authority. Ecclesiarchal courts handle matters involving religious law and doctrinal disputes, while secular courts often consult with religious authorities on cases involving moral questions or crimes against imperial faith. This integration of religious and secular legal authority creates comprehensive systems of social control that address both practical violations of imperial law and spiritual offenses against divine will. The development of imperial identity among diverse populations requires ongoing efforts to create shared cultural references and common understanding of humanity's place in the galaxy. The Ecclesiarchy promotes this identity through standardized religious texts, common ceremonial practices, and shared theological frameworks that transcend local cultural differences while preserving elements that make each community unique. This process of identity formation operates over generations as populations gradually internalize imperial values while maintaining connections to their particular cultural heritage. The opening of the Great Rift in the early 42nd millennium shattered the galaxy in ways that transcended mere physical destruction, creating a spiritual crisis that tested the foundations of imperial faith across countless worlds. As the Cicatrix Maledictum tore reality apart from the Eye of Terror to the galactic edge, it brought with it phenomena that challenged every theological framework the Adeptus Ministorum had developed over 10 millennia of doctrinal evolution. Worlds that had maintained unwavering faith for centuries found themselves plunged into perpetual twilight as the Rift's baleful light replaced their suns, while populations that had never directly encountered the Warp's malevolent influence suddenly faced demon manifestations that defied rational explanation. The immediate response from ecclesiarchal authorities varied dramatically across different regions of the galaxy, reflecting both the practical challenges of maintaining communication through the warp storms that accompanied the Rift's formation and the theological uncertainty created by events that seemed to herald the end times prophesied in the darkest imperial texts. On worlds closest to the Rift itself, local clergy found themselves forced to develop entirely new forms of spiritual warfare, as traditional prayers and rituals proved inadequate against the intensified chaos corruption that seeped through reality's wounds. These desperate innovations often pushed the boundaries of orthodox doctrine, as priests experimented with protective rites and banishment ceremonies that drew on half-remembered traditions from humanity's pre-imperial past. The phenomenon of the Noctis Aeterna, the period of galaxy-wide darkness that preceded the Rift's stabilization, created unprecedented challenges for maintaining imperial faith among populations that had been taught to associate the Emperor's protection with the light of the Astronomicon. For weeks that felt like years to those experiencing them, countless worlds found themselves cut off from astropathic communication and warp travel, their populations facing the terrifying possibility that the Emperor had finally succumbed to his millennia-long struggle against the forces of chaos. Local ecclesiarchal authorities struggled to maintain order as panic spread through communities that interpreted the darkness as divine abandonment, requiring innovative theological explanations that could preserve faith while acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the crisis. The theological responses developed during this period reflected both the Ecclesiarchy's institutional resilience and its capacity for doctrinal adaptation under extreme circumstances. Senior clergy throughout the Imperium worked to frame the Great Rift not as evidence of the Emperor's weakness, but as the ultimate test of human faith, arguing that the darkness represented a final trial that would separate the truly faithful from those whose devotion remained shallow and conditional. This interpretation drew heavily on established traditions surrounding martyrdom and suffering, extending these concepts to encompass entire populations and worlds that were called upon to endure unprecedented hardships as demonstrations of their spiritual worthiness. The emergence of new forms of demon manifestation and chaos corruption in the Rift's vicinity forced ecclesiarchal scholars to expand their understanding of the spiritual threats facing humanity while developing practical responses that could be implemented by clergy lacking specialized training in demon hunting. Traditional exorcism rites proved insufficient against entities that seemed to exist partially outside normal reality, requiring the development of new liturgies that combined elements from multiple Orthodox traditions with innovations that pushed the boundaries of acceptable theological practice. These developments occurred under extreme pressure as corrupted worlds fell to chaos influence faster than imperial forces could respond, creating a desperate race between theological innovation and spiritual catastrophe. The return of Robute Guilliman to active leadership of the Imperium created profound theological complications for an ecclesiarchy that had spent 10 millennia developing doctrine around the emperor's unique divine status and the absence of his superhuman sons from human affairs. The Primarch's resurrection by the Eldar goddess Isha and the intervention of other Xenos forces challenged fundamental assumptions about the emperor's relationship with alien species and the exclusive nature of human salvation within imperial theology. Guilliman's own complex relationship with the religious developments that had occurred during his absence created additional tensions, as his secular rationalism clashed with the faith-based governance that had become essential to imperial unity. The theological debates surrounding Guilliman's status within imperial doctrine revealed deep divisions within the Ecclesiarchy about the nature of divine authority and the proper relationship between spiritual and temporal power. Conservative elements within the religious hierarchy argued that the Primarch's return represented a divine miracle that validated traditional interpretations of imperial theology, while more progressive voices suggested that his resurrection required fundamental reconsideration of humanity's relationship with other species and the mechanisms through which the emperor's will manifested in the material universe. These debates took on practical significance as Guilliman's reforms challenged established ecclesiarchal authority in areas ranging from resource allocation to military command structures. The Primarch's personal attitudes toward the imperial creed created ongoing friction with religious authorities who had grown accustomed to operating with minimal interference from secular leadership. Guilliman's obvious discomfort with his own veneration as a figure of religious significance, combined with his pragmatic approach to governance that prioritized efficiency over doctrinal purity, challenged the ecclesiarchy's role as the primary interpreter of imperial orthodoxy. His willingness to work with Xeno's allies and employ technological innovations that bordered on heretical by traditional standards forced religious authorities to develop new theological frameworks that could accommodate these necessities while maintaining essential doctrinal principles. The integration of Primaris Space Marines into imperial military forces presented unique challenges for ecclesiarchal theology, as these enhanced warriors represented technological achievements that seemed to improve upon the emperor's original design for the Adeptus Astartes. Traditional doctrine had long emphasized the perfection of the emperor's genetic work in creating the original Space Marines, making the existence of superior variants difficult to reconcile with established theological frameworks. The ecclesiarchy faced the delicate task of developing doctrinal explanations that could accommodate Primaris Marines without undermining the theological foundations that supported the veneration of their predecessors. The theological solutions developed to address the Primaris question typically emphasized continuity rather than innovation, arguing that these enhanced warriors represented the fulfillment of the emperor's original vision rather than improvements upon his work. This interpretation suggested that the technology for creating Primaris Marines had always existed within the emperor's plans, but had been withheld until humanity faced its greatest crisis, when such enhanced capabilities would be necessary for survival. This framework allowed the ecclesiarchy to maintain doctrinal consistency while accommodating the practical reality of Primaris deployment throughout imperial forces. The enhanced physical capabilities and extended lifespans of Primaris Marines created new considerations for military chaplains, who had traditionally focused their spiritual guidance on warriors facing relatively brief service careers punctuated by high casualty rates. The prospect of Primaris Marines serving for centuries rather than decades required development of new approaches to spiritual counseling that could address the psychological challenges of extended service while maintaining the religious devotion essential to their effectiveness. These innovations drew on traditions developed for other long-lived imperial servants while adapting them to the unique circumstances of enhanced Space Marine physiology. The Indomitus Crusade's massive scale and unprecedented scope created logistical challenges for ecclesiarchal support that strained the Adeptus Ministorum's resources, while demonstrating its essential role in maintaining imperial unity across vast distances and diverse populations. The deployment of thousands of fleets across multiple sectors required coordination between religious authorities and military commanders on a scale that had not been attempted since the Great Crusade itself, necessitating new administrative structures that could provide spiritual support for forces operating far from established ecclesiarchal infrastructure. The success of these efforts validated the Ministorum's organizational capabilities, while revealing areas where additional development was necessary. The establishment of new shrine worlds and religious centers during the Crusades provided opportunities for the Ecclesiarchy to strengthen its presence in regions that had been isolated from central imperial authority for millennia. Many worlds that had maintained their own interpretations of imperial doctrine during the long isolation following the Great Rift's opening required careful theological assessment to distinguish between legitimate regional variations and dangerous heretical deviations. The process of reintegrating these populations into orthodox imperial religious practice required diplomatic skills and theological flexibility that demonstrated the Ecclesiarchy's capacity for adaptation under challenging circumstances. The psychological impact of the Crusades' victories on imperial morale created new opportunities for religious authorities to strengthen faith among populations that had begun to despair of humanity's ultimate survival. The visible evidence of imperial military resurgence, combined with the return of a Primarch to active leadership, provided tangible proof that the Emperor continued to protect his people despite the unprecedented threats they faced. Ecclesiarchal authorities worked to frame these successes within established theological frameworks that emphasized divine providence, while encouraging continued sacrifice and devotion among the faithful. The role of the Adepta Sororitas during the era Indomitus demonstrated both their military effectiveness and their unique position as the Ecclesiarchy's primary armed force in an age when religious authority faced constant challenges from secular military commanders. The sisters' participation in major crusade operations provided visible evidence of the Ministorum's continued relevance to imperial military efforts, while their specialized expertise in combating chaos corruption proved invaluable in regions affected by the Great Rift's influence. Their ability to operate independently of traditional military command structures allowed them to address threats that conventional forces might overlook or prove unable to handle effectively. The manifestation of living saints during critical moments of the Indomitus Crusade provided powerful validation of imperial theology, while raising new questions about the mechanisms through which divine power operated in the material universe. The appearance of Saint Celestine and other blessed figures at crucial battles demonstrated the Emperor's continued intervention in human affairs, while inspiring extraordinary acts of courage and devotion among imperial forces. These manifestations occurred with sufficient frequency to suggest systematic divine involvement rather than isolated miraculous events, leading to theological speculation about the relationship between the Great Rift's opening and increased supernatural activity throughout the galaxy. The coordination between the Ecclesiarchy and other imperial institutions during the era Indomitus revealed both the strengths and limitations of the religious hierarchy's integration into imperial governance. The Ministorum's extensive networks of communication and local authority proved invaluable for coordinating civilian support for military operations, while maintaining order among populations facing unprecedented hardships. However, conflicts between religious and secular priorities occasionally created operational difficulties that required careful diplomatic resolution to prevent undermining the unity essential for successful military campaigns. The expansion of ecclesiarchal educational programs to address the needs of newly liberated or discovered worlds created opportunities to strengthen imperial unity while preserving valuable local cultural traditions that could enhance rather than threaten orthodox doctrine. The development of standardized curricula that could be adapted to diverse local conditions required extensive cooperation between religious educators and cultural specialists who understood the delicate balance between doctrinal consistency and regional variation. These programs served both immediate practical needs and long-term strategic objectives by creating educated populations capable of contributing effectively to imperial civilization while maintaining unwavering loyalty to the emperor. The theological innovations developed during the era Indomitus reflected the Ecclesiarchy's capacity for doctrinal evolution under extreme pressure while maintaining essential continuity with established tradition. The integration of new experiences and challenges into orthodox imperial theology required sophisticated theological scholarship that could address unprecedented questions without undermining fundamental principles. These developments occurred through careful consultation between senior clergy and specialized theological institutions that possessed the expertise necessary to evaluate complex doctrinal questions while maintaining the authority essential for implementing new interpretations throughout the religious hierarchy. As the era Indomitus progresses into an uncertain future, the Adeptus Ministorum faces challenges that will test every aspect of its institutional capacity and theological foundation. The ongoing struggle against chaos forces empowered by the Great Rift's continued existence requires sustained religious resistance that can maintain imperial morale while providing practical spiritual protection against corruption. The integration of new military technologies and tactical innovations into established religious frameworks will require continued theological adaptation that preserves essential doctrine while accommodating necessary changes in imperial military practice. The Ecclesiarchy's role in maintaining imperial unity across a galaxy divided by the Great Rift has never been more critical, as religious authority provides one of the few remaining connections between regions that can no longer maintain regular communication or travel. The development of new forms of spiritual communion and shared religious practice that can function despite physical separation will be essential for preserving imperial civilization's coherence in an age when traditional administrative structures face unprecedented strain. The success of these efforts will determine not only the Adeptus Ministorum's future relevance, but the very survival of human civilization in its darkest hour. The legacy of 10 millennia of religious development provides the foundation for meeting these challenges, as the accumulated wisdom and institutional experience of countless generations of faithful servants offers guidance for navigating unprecedented circumstances. The theological principles established during Sebastian Thor's Reformation continue to provide essential safeguards against corruption while allowing for the flexibility necessary to address new threats and opportunities. The Ecclesiarchy's vast networks of clergy, educational institutions, and charitable organizations represent humanity's greatest asset in maintaining social cohesion and spiritual resilience during the trials that lie ahead. In this age of darkness and uncertainty, the Adeptus Ministorum stands as both guardian of humanity's soul and architect of its ultimate redemption, carrying forward the sacred trust placed in it by countless generations of the faithful while adapting to serve the needs of an imperium transformed by forces beyond mortal comprehension. The Emperor's light continues to shine through his servants' devotion, offering hope for ultimate victory even as the galaxy burns around them. Through faith, sacrifice, and unwavering service to the divine will, the Ecclesiarchy will continue its eternal mission of guiding humanity toward its destined triumph over the darkness that threatens to consume all creation.